I handed my son-in-law a $10,000 check to save my daughter's marriage. He was in such a rush to leave that he left his Italian leather briefcase on my kitchen island. I opened it to slip a fatherly note inside, but instead I found my daughter's freshly signed will and a $2 million life insurance policy. Before I could even catch my breath, police headlights lit up my living room wall. They had found her car. Just make it out to cash, Walter. Trent stood in my kitchen at 4 in the morning. His voice was smooth like expensive synthetic motor oil, but his eyes kept darting toward the dark front window. He was a slick investment broker, a man who made his living moving invisible numbers around on computer screens. I am 68 years old. My name is Walter Hayes. For 40 straight years, I rebuilt heavy-duty diesel engines for commercial transport trucks. I know the deep rattling sound of a failing transmission, and I know the desperate shifting look of a man who is telling a lie. But I kept my head down, and I kept writing the check. The pen felt terribly small in my thick, calloused fingers. My knuckles are permanently swollen with arthritis and stained with grease that no pumice soap in the world will ever scrub out. I earned every single penny in my checking account by breathing in toxic exhaust fumes and tearing up my lower back on freezing concrete floors. I worked double shifts for decades so my little girl Sarah would never have to scrape by the way I did. I paid for her college tuition in pure cash so she could marry a man in a tailored suit instead of a man in dirty coveralls. And now, here I was standing under the humming fluorescent light of my kitchen, handing over $10,000 of my hard-earned retirement money to that exact man in a tailored suit. Trent paced across my worn linoleum floor. His expensive leather shoes clicked sharply with every step. They were the kind of shoes that had never stepped in a puddle of muddy water, let alone motor oil. He looked entirely out of place in my humble home. "It is just a sudden tax lien, Walter," Trent lied smoothly, running a manicured hand through his perfectly styled hair. "The IRS made a massive mistake on our joint filing from 3 years ago. They are threatening to freeze all our accounts and put a federal lien on the house by noon today. Sarah is terrified. You know how bad her anxiety gets when she feels insecure. This money will clear the freeze immediately and keep our marriage from falling apart under the stress. I promise you will get every dime back with interest by next week." I did not look up from my leather checkbook. I knew he was lying about the IRS. The federal government does not move overnight, and they absolutely do not demand $10,000 in untraceable cash before the sun even comes up. But Trent knew my one profound weakness. He used my daughter Sarah as a shield. He knew I would empty my last dime and sell the roof over my head if it meant my daughter could sleep peacefully without worrying about losing her home. I finished writing the zeros. I drew a thick, dark line across the empty space so no one could alter the amount. I tore the check from the ledger and held it out across the counter. Trent snatched the paper from my hand with the speed of a striking snake. He did not say thank you. He did not express any genuine relief. He just folded the check twice and shoved it deep into the breast pocket of his designer jacket. He looked down at his heavy gold watch. It was 4:15 in the morning. He claimed he had to drive 3 hours to the regional tax office in Atlanta before they opened their doors. I watched him swallow hard. A single bead of sweat rolled down his perfectly trimmed sideburn. A man making a routine tax payment does not sweat in an air-conditioned kitchen in the middle of the night. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne and fear. "I will call you later, Walter," Trent said over his shoulder as he practically ran toward the back door. "Tell Sarah I love her when you talk to her today." That sentence struck me as deeply odd. Tell Sarah I love her. Why wouldn't a husband tell his own wife he loves her when he gets back home? Trent hurried out the back door. The heavy wooden screen door slammed violently shut behind him, rattling the window frames in the kitchen. I stood quietly at the window above the sink and watched him jog to his black Mercedes parked in my gravel driveway. He fired up the German engine. The tires spun aggressively, throwing sharp gravel into my prize azalea bushes as he tore out into the dark, empty street. The red taillights vanished around the corner. The house went completely dead quiet again. Only the humming of my old refrigerator remained. I turned around to pour myself a cup of bitter black coffee from the pot I had brewed when he woke me up. That is when I saw it. Sitting dead center on my kitchen island under the overhead light was Trent's briefcase. It was thick black leather with heavy polished brass buckles. He had been clutching it so tightly to his chest when he arrived begging for money. But in his frantic, greedy rush to grab my $10,000 and run, he had completely forgotten it. I stared at the dark leather object. I should have picked up my cell phone and called him. I should have run out to the street and waved him down. But a heavy, cold feeling settled deep in my gut. A father's intuition is a very powerful and dangerous thing. Something was terribly wrong. I walked slowly over to the kitchen island. I rested my rough, cracked hand on the smooth, expensive leather. I told myself I was just going to leave him a note, a simple piece of paper tucked inside his files to remind him that I was watching him. I wanted to write something like, "You better take care of my little girl Trent, or you will have to answer to me." I thought it would be a firm reminder from an old mechanic that he was not untouchable. I reached down and unlatched the brass buckles. They clicked open loudly in the silent room. I pulled back the heavy leather flap, expecting to see a sleek silver laptop or glossy financial portfolios from his investment firm. Instead, there was no laptop. There were no client folders. There was only a single thick manila envelope sitting at the bottom of the empty briefcase. I reached inside and pulled the envelope out. The first thing I saw was a thick stack of heavy white paper bound by a blue legal spine. At the top of the very first page in bold black letters it read, "Last Will and Testament of Sarah Hayes." My heart skipped a painful beat. I pulled my wire reading glasses from my shirt pocket and put them on. The date at the top of the document was yesterday. The blue ink from the state notary stamp at the bottom of the page was so fresh it almost looked wet. I read the first paragraph. Then I read the second. The legal words made my stomach turn to solid ice. This was not a standard married couple's will. This document completely and ruthlessly stripped my 2 young grandchildren of their entire inheritance. It revoked all previous trusts. It transferred total absolute control of Sarah's family money directly to Trent. If Sarah died, Trent got every single penny with zero legal oversight from the courts or the family. My hands began to shake violently. I am not a weak man. I have lifted engine blocks and survived terrible accidents. But reading your own child's financial death preparations will make any father tremble. I dug deeper into the manila folder. Beneath the revised will was another document. It was a massive corporate life insurance policy from a major firm out of Chicago. The primary beneficiary was Trent. The insured party was my daughter Sarah. The guaranteed payout amount was $2 million. I stared closely at the fine print on the second page. It was an accelerated payout policy. That is a very specific type of insurance. It is the kind of policy that bypasses the standard 90-day investigation periods and pays out immediately upon the receipt of a certified death certificate. And the most terrifying detail was printed at the very bottom of the receipt. The massive first premium had been paid in full in cash just 12 hours ago. I stood there alone in my dimly lit kitchen, trying desperately to make the twisted pieces fit together. Trent came to my house begging for $10,000 in cash in the middle of the night, claiming he needed to save his house from the government. But yesterday afternoon, he somehow had enough liquid cash to buy a $2 million expedited life insurance policy on my daughter's life. Why would a wealthy man need $10,000 in untraceable cash immediately after securing a massive payout on his wife's life? The ugly, brutal math in my head started screaming at me. The $10,000 was never meant for taxes. It was a payoff. He needed clean, untraceable cash right now to pay someone for a dirty job. A job he absolutely could not leave a digital paper trail for. He needed to pay someone to help him. A wave of pure, sickening nausea hit me so hard I had to lean heavily against the kitchen counter to keep from falling over. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. I reached frantically for the wall phone hanging next to the refrigerator. I needed to call Sarah right this second. I needed to hear her voice. I needed to wake her up and tell her to lock her bedroom door and get out of that house. I picked up the heavy plastic receiver and began to punch in the numbers with trembling, greasy fingers. But before I could dial the last 4 digits, a blindingly bright light slashed violently across my living room wall. It was harsh and rotating, flashing red and blue. The intense light swept rapidly through my front windows, casting long, moving shadows across the hardwood floorboards. The lights bounced off the family portraits hanging on the wall. I dropped the phone. The receiver dangled wildly by its curly cord, beeping loudly into the empty, quiet room. My chest felt completely hollow. My legs moved like they were made of lead. I walked slowly out of the kitchen and stepped into the living room. I reached the front window and pulled back the heavy fabric curtains. It was exactly 5:30 in the morning. The sky outside was still pitch black. A white county sheriff cruiser was parked diagonally across my driveway, blocking my old truck. The engine was still running, leaving a cloud of white exhaust rising in the chilly morning air. The heavy light bar on the roof was spinning, throwing aggressive red and blue warnings into the peaceful neighborhood. 2 uniformed deputies were getting out of the cruiser. They were putting their wide-brimmed hats on. Their faces were cast in dark, grim shadows. They walked slowly up my front sidewalk with their heads bowed. They were not walking like men who were here to tell me my truck was parked illegally. They were not walking like men looking for a lost dog. They were walking with the heavy, reluctant steps of men who were about to destroy a father's entire world. They were walking up to my door to tell me they had found her car. I opened my heavy wooden front door and the cold morning air rushed into my quiet house. The 2 county deputies standing on my porch took off their wide-brimmed hats the moment they saw my face. They were young men. They looked like they had barely been out of the police academy for a year, but they already carried that heavy, terrible look in their eyes. It is the look men get when they have to deliver news that will destroy a family. The taller deputy swallowed hard and asked if I was Walter Hayes. I told him I was. He looked down at his black boots for a second before he spoke. He told me that my daughter Sarah was gone. He said they found her white SUV parked abandoned on the Oconee River Bridge just an hour ago. The engine was still running. The driver's side door was left wide open facing the dark water, and there was a handwritten suicide note sitting on the dashboard. The deputy reached out a hand as if he expected me to collapse right there on my front porch. A normal father would have. A normal father who had just been woken up at 5:30 in the morning to hear his little girl had jumped off a bridge would have dropped to his knees and screamed at the sky. But I did not fall. I did not cry a single tear. My body went completely rigid like a block of solid cast iron. The horrible math in my head was screaming at me. I was just staring at the $2 million life insurance policy sitting on my kitchen island. I was just staring at the newly signed will that cut out my grandchildren. I knew exactly what was happening. This was not a tragic suicide. This was a staged execution. I looked the deputy dead in the eye and told him I needed to see the car. I told him I needed to go to the river right now. They nodded and opened the back door of their cruiser for me. I climbed into the back seat and we sped off into the dark, early morning. The ride to the Oconee River was completely silent. The flashing red and blue lights of the cruiser bounced off the tall Georgia pine trees lining the highway. I sat in the back with my rough, calloused hands folded in my lap. I was not praying for her soul. I was praying that I was right. I was praying that she was still alive out there somewhere, and that this was just a sloppy cover-up by a greedy, arrogant man. When we arrived at the bridge, the sun was barely starting to peek over the horizon. The thick gray fog was rolling off the cold, dark water of the Oconee River. The scene was an absolute circus. There were half a dozen police cruisers parked at odd angles with their lights blindingly bright in the morning mist. Yellow police tape was strung across the metal guardrails. Down below in the muddy water, I could hear the heavy motors of the police search boats. They were already dragging the river bottom with hooks. The sound of those engines tore at my heart, but I forced myself to stay completely focused. I stepped out of the cruiser and looked toward the center of the bridge. That is when I saw him. Trent was standing near the yellow tape surrounded by 2 local news camera crews. He was putting on an absolute masterclass in deception. He was wearing the same tailored suit he had on in my kitchen just an hour ago, but now his tie was ripped loose. He was sobbing loudly. He was burying his face in his hands and leaning heavily against a police officer as if his legs could no longer support his own weight. He was wailing about how he should have been there for her. He was crying about how the stress of their finances must have finally broken her mind. It was an Oscar-worthy performance of a grieving husband. If I had not looked inside that leather briefcase, I would have believed every single tear. But I knew the truth. I knew he was crying for the cameras because he needed a public record of his grief when he filed that insurance claim. I did not walk over to him. I did not want to look at his fake tears because I knew if I got close to him, I would wrap my hands around his throat and strangle him in front of the cameras. I would end up in a jail cell and I would never be able to find out what really happened to my daughter. Instead, I turned my back to the cameras and walked straight towards Sarah's abandoned white SUV. A young police officer tried to step in front of me to stop me from crossing the yellow tape. The deputy who brought me placed a hand on the young officer's shoulder and whispered that I was the father. The officer backed away with a sympathetic nod and let me pass. They thought I just wanted to see the last place my daughter had been alive. They thought I was just an old grieving man looking for closure. They did not realize they were letting a master mechanic inspect a crime scene. For 40 years, I made my living diagnosing massive, complex diesel engines. When a machine breaks down, it leaves clues. A skilled mechanic does not just look at the broken part. He looks at the entire system to see what forces caused the failure. He looks for things that are out of place. He looks for scratches on the metal. He looks for fluid leaks. He looks for anything that contradicts the official story. I walked up to the open driver's side door of the SUV, and I let my eyes do what they had been trained to do for 4 decades. The first thing I noticed was the seat position. Sarah is a very petite woman. She is exactly 5'3" tall. Ever since she got her driver license at 16, she has always had to pull her car seat all the way forward just to reach the gas and brake pedals comfortably. Her chest always rested just a few inches from the steering wheel. But as I looked into the cabin of the SUV, the driver's seat was pushed all the way back on its metal tracks. It was pushed back so far that a person of her height would not even be able to touch the pedals with their toes. Someone tall drove this car to the bridge. Someone at least 6 feet tall. Trent is exactly 6'1". I kept my face completely blank so the police standing nearby would not notice my discovery. I leaned closer to the open door, pretending to be overwhelmed by the sight of her empty car. I looked down at the driver's side floorboard. Sarah was a perfectionist when it came to her vehicles. She kept her car absolutely spotless. She never allowed anyone to eat in it, and she always knocked her shoes clean before getting inside. But the black carpet mat on the floorboard was covered in thick, wet, gray mud. It was smeared deeply into the fabric as if someone had been kicking and thrashing wildly. The mud was not just on the floor, it was smeared on the plastic trim near the door sill and on the side of the seat cushion. This was not the neat, orderly exit of a woman who calmly parked her car and walked to the edge of a bridge to end her life. This was the chaotic, frantic mess of a violent struggle. I crouched down slightly, resting my hand on the door frame to support my bad knees. I stared hard into the shadows of the floorboard where the mud was thickest. My eyes caught a tiny glint of yellow metal wedged deep beside the seat track. It was incredibly small. The police evidence technicians had completely missed it in the dark morning light. I slowly reached my thick fingers down into the muddy gap and pulled it out. I kept it hidden in the palm of my hand and stood up holding it close to my chest. It was a broken gold clasp. I recognized it instantly, and my heart felt like it had been pierced by a hot iron nail. It was the clasp to a vintage gold wristwatch. It was the exact watch her grandmother had given her on her wedding day. Sarah loved that watch more than anything she owned. She wore it every single day, and she was incredibly gentle with it because the metal was old and fragile. She would never take it off carelessly. But the tiny metal bar on the clasp was violently bent backward. It had been snapped by pure brute force. The picture of what happened here became crystal clear in my mind. She did not drive this car to the bridge. Trent drove this car. He pushed the seat back to fit his long legs. Sarah was likely in the passenger seat or maybe even tied up in the back. When they got to the bridge, there was a struggle. She fought him. She kicked the floorboards with muddy shoes she had picked up from wherever he had taken her first. He grabbed her by the wrist to pull her out of the car, and the force of his grip snapped the clasp of her grandmother's watch right off her arm. She did not jump into that dark river. She was taken. I slowly slipped the broken gold piece into the front pocket of my heavy denim jeans. I had the physical proof I needed. I had the evidence that the police were too blind to see. Now I needed to find out where he hid her. I stood up straight and took a deep breath of the cold river air. I was no longer a confused, grieving father. I was a hunter. I turned around to walk back toward the police cruisers. As I stepped away from the car, I saw Trent breaking away from the news cameras. He whispered something to a reporter and patted the police chief on the shoulder, playing the role of the exhausted, broken man. He began walking slowly toward me. His head was bowed and his shoulders were slumped. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the entire world on his back. But as he got closer to me, he stepped out of the bright glare of the police lights and into the shadows near the guardrail. We were completely alone for just a brief moment. No cameras could see his face. No police officers were close enough to hear his voice. The transformation was instant, and it was truly terrifying. The heavy slumped shoulders straightened up perfectly. The trembling hands became perfectly still. The mask of the weeping, devastated husband melted away in a single second, leaving behind a face of pure, cold calculation. His eyes were completely dry. There was no redness. There was no sorrow. There was only a sharp, predatory panic. He stopped just 2 feet away from me. He looked around quickly to make sure no one was watching us. Then he leaned in close. I could smell the expensive synthetic cologne on his neck mixed with the smell of the damp river fog. He looked down at me, treating me like the slow, ignorant mechanic he always believed I was. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not ask how I was handling the news about my daughter. He leaned directly into my ear and dropped his voice to a harsh, urgent whisper. "Walter, did I leave my briefcase at your house? I need it right now." He leaned directly into my ear and dropped his voice to a harsh, urgent whisper. "Walter, did I leave my briefcase at your house? I need it right now." Every single muscle in my back tightened like a coiled steel spring. He was standing so incredibly close to me that I could feel the heat radiating off his expensive wool suit. I could smell the sharp metallic scent of the river mud mixed with his rich synthetic cologne. My rough hands were shoved deep inside my heavy denim pockets. My right hand was gripping the broken gold clasp of my daughter's vintage watch so hard that the jagged metal was physically cutting into my palm. I wanted to pull my fist out of my pocket and drive it squarely into his perfectly structured jaw. I wanted to tackle him to the wet gravel and beat the absolute truth out of him right there on the dark bank of the Oconee River. But I am not a foolish man. I am a father who has spent a lifetime fixing broken things by figuring out exactly how the system works. I knew that if I lost my temper, the police would immediately tackle me to the ground. They would put me in handcuffs and throw me in the back of a locked cruiser. Trent would walk away clean, playing the victim. He would have all the time in the world to go straight back to my empty house and retrieve that leather briefcase before anyone knew what was inside it. I had to play the game. I had to be the weak, confused, broken old man he firmly believed I was. I let my heavy shoulders slump forward. I let my jaw go slack, and I forced my eyes to look unfocused and terrified. I turned my head slowly to look up at him. "What briefcase, Trent?" I asked, letting my rough voice tremble pitifully in the cold morning air. "I have not seen any briefcase. Did you leave it in your car before you came inside?" Trent stared at me intensely. His dark eyes darted back and forth across my wrinkled face, looking for any microscopic sign of deception. He was a man who lied for a living to wealthy investors, so he knew exactly what to look for. I held my breath and kept my hands trembling visibly inside my pockets. I let a single tear roll down my cheek. I whispered my daughter's name over and over again, like my brain was completely snapping from the grief. Trent let out a long, heavy breath. The sharp, violent panic in his eyes faded into a cruel, arrogant relief. He bought it. He truly believed I was just a senile old mechanic whose mind had finally broken under the weight of tragedy. He patted me firmly on the shoulder with fake sympathy and walked back toward the flashing police lights, leaving me entirely alone in the shadows. The next 48 hours were a living, breathing nightmare. The local county police dragged the dark river for 2 straight days. They brought in specialized dive teams from the state capitol. They flew helicopters with thermal imaging cameras up and down the muddy riverbanks. They found absolutely nothing. There was no body caught in the submerged tree branches. There was no clothing washed up on the rocky shore. Sarah had simply vanished into the mist. The local news stations ran the tragic story every single hour of the day. They showed beautiful pictures of her smiling face alongside high-definition footage of Trent wiping away fake tears in front of their massive suburban home. I sat completely alone in my dark living room watching the television screen with the volume turned all the way down to 0. My house felt like a cold stone tomb. The silence was so heavy it made my ears ring constantly. But I did not sleep. I drank bitter black coffee and stared at the thick leather briefcase sitting locked on my kitchen table. On the morning of the 3rd day, my home phone rang. It was a clerk from the county probate court. I had known her for 20 years because I used to fix her husband's commercial work trucks for free when times were tough. She was calling to warn me as a personal courtesy. She told me Trent had just walked into the courthouse and filed an emergency legal petition to have Sarah officially declared dead. He was aggressively bypassing the standard waiting periods by claiming severe financial hardship and emotional distress over the welfare of his children. I asked her how a judge could possibly approve a legally binding death certificate without recovering a body. She lowered her voice to a barely audible whisper and told me the petition had been fast-tracked directly to Judge Corliss. My stomach turned to absolute lead. Judge Corliss was a wealthy, corrupt local official who played golf with Trent every single Sunday morning at the private country club. Trent was cashing in his expensive favors. He was pushing the American legal system to its absolute limit because he was running out of time. I hung up the heavy plastic phone and walked slowly into the kitchen. I looked down at the $10,000 check carbon copy still sitting in my open ledger. It all made perfect, terrifying sense now. Trent was a multi-million-dollar investment broker. He managed massive financial portfolios for extremely wealthy clients. Why would a man with access to that kind of immense wealth need a $10,000 personal check from his working-class father-in-law in the middle of the night? It was not because he was actually broke. It was because his own money was heavily monitored. If Trent withdrew $10,000 in cash from his own corporate bank account, the federal regulators and his firm would see it instantly. It would leave a permanent digital fingerprint. But a handwritten personal check from an old mechanic was entirely clean. It was untraceable to his corporate ledgers. He did not need my money to pay off the IRS. He needed liquid cash immediately to pay the man who helped him at the river. He needed to pay the man who violently dragged my daughter out of her car and broke her grandmother's watch. And now he was rushing the death certificate through a corrupt judge so he could collect the $2 million life insurance payout and replace whatever massive amount of money he was secretly hiding before anyone looked too closely at his books. I desperately needed help. I could not go to the local police department. Trent had the judge securely in his pocket, and he probably had half the precinct bought off too. It was my word and a broken watch clasp against a wealthy, grieving widower. I walked over to my kitchen drawer and pulled out my little black address book. I flipped past the greasy, stained pages until I found the specific number for Roy. Roy and I had been weekend fishing buddies for over 15 years. He was a quiet, incredibly patient man who never spoke louder than he absolutely had to. Before he retired to spend his days sitting in an aluminum flat-bottom boat on Lake Sinclair, Roy had been a senior forensic accountant for the state police. He spent 30 years tracking dirty money for the government. He could find a single stolen dollar buried deep at the bottom of a massive corporate ledger. He was the only man in the entire world I trusted with my daughter's life right now. I called his number and told him I needed his professional help immediately. I did not explain anything over the phone. I just told him to bring his encrypted laptop and to come directly to my back door. Roy arrived exactly 20 minutes later. He stepped into my kitchen and took one long look at my face. He knew exactly how bad the situation was without me saying a word. I poured him a mug of strong coffee and laid the contents of Trent's briefcase out on the kitchen island. I showed Roy the freshly signed will cutting out the children. I showed him the $2 million accelerated life insurance policy. And then, I carefully placed the broken gold clasp of Sarah's watch right in the center of the documents. Roy did not ask any useless emotional questions. He calmly adjusted his thick-framed glasses and read through the complex legal papers in complete, absolute silence. When he finally finished, he looked up at me and said, "We need to see exactly where your $10,000 check went." I told him I did not have any access to Trent's private bank accounts. Roy smiled a very thin, grim smile. He said, "We do not need Trent's accounts, Walter. We just need Sarah's accounts. If she was handling the daily household bills, her personal devices might still have automatic access to the joint banking information." My heart jumped wildly in my chest. I rushed down the hallway and into the spare bedroom. This was the room my grandchildren always slept in when they visited me on the weekends. Sitting on the small wooden nightstand next to a stack of old coloring books was a silver iPad. Sarah had bought a brand new one for herself last year, and she left this older model at my house so the kids could play games and watch movies when I was busy fixing their bicycles in the garage. I picked it up and wiped a thin layer of dust off the glass screen. It felt so heavy in my hands. It felt like a living piece of her. I carried it back into the kitchen and set it down gently in front of Roy. I pressed the small power button on the top edge. The screen glowed to life, showing a bright, colorful picture of Sarah hugging her 2 children at the beach. A lump formed in my throat so thick I could hardly swallow my own saliva. I had to look away to keep my composure. Roy gently tapped the glowing screen. He asked me if I knew the 4-digit passcode. I told him it was the kids' birth years. Roy typed in the numbers, and the iPad unlocked instantly. Sarah had never logged out of her primary email or her cloud backup on this specific device. Roy connected the iPad to his heavy black laptop using a white cord he pulled from his canvas bag. His fingers started flying incredibly fast across his keyboard. He was silently bypassing basic security protocols and digging deep into the digital footprint of her marriage. For an entire hour, the only sound in my kitchen was the rapid rhythmic clicking of keys and the low hum of the refrigerator. I stood by the window, gripping the cold edge of the stainless steel sink, waiting patiently for him to find the thread that would unravel Trent's entire lie. Finally, Roy stopped typing. He leaned back in his wooden chair and took a slow, deliberate sip of his cold black coffee. "I got it," he said quietly. He turned his laptop screen toward me so I could see. On the glowing monitor was a high-resolution scanned image of the $10,000 check I had written to Trent just 3 days ago. The front of the check looked exactly the way I had written it in my own handwriting, but Roy pressed a button and flipped the digital image to show the back of the check. Trent had not deposited the money into his own bank account. He had not taken it to a bank teller to cash it. He had endorsed the back of the check entirely over to a third party. There was a messy scrawled signature and a stamped business account number. Roy pointed a steady finger to the name printed boldly on the endorsement line. It was made out to a commercial LLC called Iron City Salvage. I asked Roy what a wealthy investment broker was doing signing a $10,000 check over to a dirty scrap metal yard. Roy started typing again, running the business name through a restricted state registry database he still had backdoor access to. A few seconds later, a driver license photo popped up on the screen. It was a large man with a thick scarred neck, a shaved head, and cold, dead eyes. Roy read the screen aloud to me. The salvage yard is owned by a local operator named Buster Hayes. He is not a mechanic, Walter. He has served serious time in the state penitentiary. He has 2 separate felony convictions for armed extortion and 1 for aggravated assault. The air in the kitchen went completely freezing cold. Trent did not just hire some random thug off the street to scare my daughter. He handed $10,000 of my own hard-earned money directly to a violent convicted felon. Buster was the man who dragged Sarah out of her car. He was the man who left that broken watch in the mud. And right now, he was the only man in the world who knew where my daughter was hidden. I stared at the computer screen in my kitchen while Roy sat quietly drinking his dark coffee. I knew right then and there that I could not go to the police with this new information. If I walked into the local precinct and told them Trent paid a salvage yard owner $10,000, they would just look at me like I was crazy. It was still just my word and a broken watch clasp against a wealthy, grieving widower who played golf with the county judge every weekend. Trent would hear about my police report in 10 minutes. He would immediately call Buster, and Buster would make absolutely sure my daughter was never found. I had to do this myself. I had to go to Iron City Salvage and look the devil directly in the eye. Roy tried his best to talk me out of it, but he knew I was a stubborn old diesel mechanic with nothing left to lose. He reached deep into his canvas bag and handed me a small, black magnetic GPS tracker. He told me to use it if I somehow got the chance. I put the heavy little device in my front pocket and grabbed my thick canvas work coat. I walked out to my beat-up Ford truck. The engine roared to life with a loud, familiar, rattling hum. I put the truck in gear and drove straight toward the gritty industrial side of town. Iron City Salvage was located at the absolute dead end of a broken asphalt road right near the county line. The air out there smelled thick like burning rubber and old, rotten transmission fluid. The entire property was surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with deeply rusted razor wire. Mountains of crushed cars and twisted metal frames piled up high against the gray morning sky, blocking out the sun. I parked my truck outside the main gate and turned off the engine. I sat in the cab for a moment and took a deep, steadying breath. I needed to play the exact same role I had played for Trent in my kitchen. I needed to be a broken, confused, senile old man. I hunched my broad shoulders forward and let my rough hands shake just a little bit. I walked slowly through the open metal gate and stepped into the muddy, filthy yard. A massive man was standing near a large flatbed tow truck. He had a thick, heavily scarred neck and a completely shaved head. His massive hands were covered in thick black grease and dirt. It was Vance Buster Hayes. He looked exactly like his state penitentiary mugshot, but he was even bigger and more intimidating in person. He had the cold, dead, flat eyes of a man who would gladly hurt a woman for money without losing a single second of sleep. I shuffled toward him, dragging my left heavy work boot slightly in the wet dirt. He turned his massive body and glared down at me. He asked me what I wanted in a harsh voice that sounded exactly like grinding metal. I put on a weak, confused little smile. I told him I was looking for an old radiator for a '98 Chevy pickup truck. I rambled on and on about how my grandson desperately needed the truck to get to his high school and how I just could not afford to buy a brand new part from the dealership. I intentionally talked way too much, and I let my voice crack pitifully. Buster looked at me with absolute pure disgust. He saw a pathetic, weak old fool exactly like I wanted him to see. He pointed a greasy, thick finger toward a massive pile of rusted trucks all the way at the very back of the 3-acre lot. He told me the Chevy parts were all the way back there, and I would have to pull the radiator out myself. I thanked him profusely, bowing my head slightly, and started shuffling slowly toward the back of the massive scrap lot. I walked very slowly until Buster finally turned his back to grab a heavy steel chain from the bed of his tow truck. The exact second he was completely out of sight behind a huge stack of crushed minivans, I dropped the old man act entirely. I straightened my back. I moved with the quiet, deliberate speed of a man who had spent 40 years navigating dangerous, crowded garage floors. I ducked low behind a rusted-out yellow school bus and circled quickly back toward his main office. It was a filthy, single-wide trailer sitting unevenly on cinder blocks right near the front gate. The wooden steps groaned slightly under the heavy weight of my work boots, but the loud, mechanical sounds of the scrapyard covered the noise perfectly. I turned the greasy brass doorknob and slipped quickly inside the dark room. The smell inside the trailer was absolutely suffocating. It smelled intensely like stale cigarette smoke, cheap sour beer, and old unwashed sweat. The thin walls were completely covered in dirty calendars and past due paper invoices pinned to the cheap wood paneling. I knew I only had a few precious minutes before he realized I was not back at the Chevy pile pulling parts. I started searching the room just with my eyes. I did not touch a single thing yet. A good mechanic always looks at the entire engine block before he puts his hands on the delicate parts. I looked at the overflowing trash can sitting by the door. I looked at the incredibly messy metal desk covered in fast food wrappers. Then I saw the heavy steel workbench sitting in the far dark corner of the room. There was a large, heavy-duty cast iron vise bolted directly to the top of the bench. Something small was clamped incredibly tight inside the metal jaws. I walked over quietly and looked very closely. It was a modern smartphone. The thick, solid steel jaws of the vise had been cranked down so brutally hard that the glass screen was completely shattered into a million tiny sharp spider webs. The metal casing of the phone was violently bent and warped out of shape. I leaned in much closer, and the blood in my veins ran absolutely freezing cold. On the back of the crushed, ruined phone, sticking out of the twisted metal, was a small, faded sticker of a little cartoon turtle. My youngest grandson had proudly put that exact sticker on Sarah's phone just 3 months ago. This was my daughter's cell phone. He had deliberately crushed it in the heavy vise to permanently destroy the internal GPS tracking signal. She was definitely here. She had been physically dragged into this filthy, disgusting room. My heart hammered painfully against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had to find out where he took her after he destroyed her only way of calling for help. I spun around quickly and frantically looked at the walls again. Behind his dirty metal desk was a very large topographical map of the state pinned directly to the cheap wood paneling. I walked quickly behind the desk and studied the map intently. There were several black markings drawn all near the salvage yard location, but my eyes were instantly drawn to a very thick red circle drawn in permanent marker. It was located 3 counties over deep up in the heavily wooded mountains. I instantly recognized the specific county line. I pulled my wire reading glasses from my shirt pocket and leaned inches away from the paper map. The red circle was drawn exactly around a massive tract of private land. I knew that specific land. 2 years ago, Trent bragged to me at a family Thanksgiving dinner about how his wealthy investment firm had just purchased 500 acres of remote hunting property in that exact area as a massive corporate tax write-off. They had a large private cabin out there where the brokers went to drink expensive whiskey and shoot rifles on the long weekends. It was completely off the grid. There was absolutely zero cell service, and it was miles away from the nearest paved public road. That is exactly where Buster took her. They were holding my daughter at the corporate hunting cabin. I reached my shaking hand into my pocket to grab my own phone so I could take a clear picture of the map to show Roy. But before my hand could even touch my phone, the door to the filthy trailer swung violently open. The heavy metal hit the thin wall with a deafening crash. I froze completely solid. Buster stood entirely in the doorway, blocking the only way out. His massive, wide frame filled the entire frame of the open door. He was holding a solid steel heavy-duty tire iron tightly in his right hand. The thick veins in his heavily scarred neck were bulging out. His cold, dead eyes locked directly onto me, standing right behind his desk. He did not bother asking what I was doing. He knew exactly what I had seen. He saw me looking at the crushed phone in the vise, and he saw me standing inches away from his marked map. A cruel, ugly, dark smile slowly spread across his scarred, brutal face. He gripped the heavy tire iron even tighter. He took a slow, deliberate, heavy step into the trailer. He reached back and locked the deadbolt on the door behind him with a loud, terrifying metallic click. He told me in a low, rumbling voice that I was entirely too nosy for a senile old man. He calmly said I was going to have a very bad, tragic accident out in the scrapyard today. I was completely trapped. I had absolutely no weapons. I had a bad lower back and severe arthritis in both of my knees. I was locked inside a small room with a highly violent convicted felon who was about to cave my skull in with a solid piece of steel. If I tried to physically fight him man to man, I would definitely lose. I would die on this filthy linoleum floor and Sarah would never ever be found. I had to urgently use the only weapon I still had left. I had to use his arrogant belief that I was incredibly weak. As Buster raised the heavy solid steel tire iron high above his bald head, I suddenly gasped incredibly loudly. I grabbed the center of my own chest with both of my rough hands. I squeezed my own heavy shirt tightly, violently twisting the fabric. I let my eyes roll back slightly into my head and I forced my knees to buckle underneath me. I collapsed heavily onto the dirty linoleum floor, hitting the hard ground hard enough to genuinely bruise my hip bone. I curled my body into a very tight ball, gasping frantically for air like a fish thrown violently onto a hot wooden dock. I started making terrible wet choking sounds deep inside my throat. I completely and utterly committed to the desperate performance of an old man having a massive fatal heart attack. I kicked my heavy work boots aggressively against his metal desk, making a terrible loud racket in the small room. Buster froze completely mid-swing. His dead eyes went wide with sudden extreme panic. He was a violent, brutal criminal, but he was absolutely not stupid. He knew perfectly well that if an old man died of a heart attack inside his locked office, the local police would eventually come. The county coroner would come. They would thoroughly search his entire property. They would easily find the crushed phone in the vise. They would find the $10,000 check trail linking him to Trent. A dead human body in his office right now was the absolute worst possible thing that could ever happen to his illegal operation. He quickly dropped the heavy tire iron. It hit the floor with a loud, sharp ringing clang. He rushed forward and grabbed me roughly by the thick collar of my heavy canvas coat. He cursed incredibly loudly, screaming at me not to die inside his trailer. He dragged my heavy, limp body violently across the dirty floor. I let my arms drag completely uselessly at my sides. I kept gasping and wheezing loudly, intentionally making my face turn bright red from holding my breath so tight. He dragged me out the door and violently pulled me down the wooden steps. Buster practically hauled me through the muddy front yard toward the open main gate. He was sweating very heavily now, totally terrified that he was about to have a major murder investigation on his hands. He dragged me all the way to my beat-up Ford F-150. He yanked the heavy driver's side door open and practically threw me onto the worn bench seat. He screamed at me to drive straight to the local hospital and never ever come back to his salvage yard. He violently slammed my heavy truck door shut and backed away rapidly, breathing hard. I slumped forward over the steering wheel, keeping the desperate act going. I fumbled for my truck keys with wildly shaking hands. I finally managed to get the key into the ignition and the old engine roared loudly to life. I put the heavy truck into reverse. But as I slowly backed out of the parking space, I knew I had one brief single second to make my final move. I cranked the steering wheel incredibly hard to the left, bringing the entire side of my truck dangerously close to his parked flatbed tow truck right near the gate. I hit the brakes hard. I reached my left hand out the open window. I tightly held the small black magnetic GPS tracker Roy had given me. In one single, smooth, practiced mechanical motion, I reached down completely out of Buster's line of sight and slapped the heavy, strong magnet hard against the inside of Buster's front wheel well. It locked securely onto the dirty steel frame with a solid, reassuring metallic click. I pulled my hand back inside the cab immediately. I stomped my boot on the gas pedal and tore out of the dirt parking lot, kicking up a massive, thick cloud of gray dust into the morning air. I drove exactly 2 miles down the main highway before I finally pulled over safely onto the loose gravel shoulder. My chest was genuinely heaving now. The pure adrenaline was violently pumping through my old veins like liquid fire. My rough hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my swollen knuckles were completely white. I took a few very deep, long breaths to calm my racing, hammering heart. I had survived the room. I had found her crushed phone. I had memorized the map. And I had successfully planted the bug. I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. Roy had properly connected the GPS tracker directly to an application on my phone before I even left my kitchen. I eagerly opened the application and stared closely at the bright, glowing screen. There was a very small, blinking green dot clearly representing Buster's flatbed tow truck. For a few agonizing minutes, the bright dot remained perfectly still back at the salvage yard location. I sat completely alone in my quiet truck, listening to the steady, reliable hum of my engine. Then suddenly my phone let out a very sharp, loud, buzzing vibration. I looked down quickly. The green dot was moving. It was moving incredibly fast. Buster had seriously panicked. He knew I had clearly seen the map and the phone. He was not waiting around to see if I actually went to the hospital or the police. The green dot quickly turned off the small county road and merged directly onto the main interstate highway. I watched the digital path very carefully. The truck was heading aggressively north. It was driving completely straight at very high speed, heading exactly toward the thick red circle drawn on his office wall. He was heading straight for the remote hunting property 3 counties over. He was going to desperately move her, or much worse, he was going to finish the job Trent paid him for. I threw my heavy F-150 back into drive and violently slammed my heavy boot down on the gas pedal. I was coming for my daughter, and nothing on this earth was going to stop me. I drove north for almost 3 hours as the sky above the Georgia mountains turned the dark, ugly color of a deeply bruised plum. The heavy gray clouds rolled violently over the tall pine trees, and then the sky completely opened up. The rain did not just fall from the clouds, it attacked my truck. It was a blinding, brutal storm that instantly turned the steep, winding asphalt roads into highly dangerous, slick rivers. I leaned my face close to the cold windshield with both of my rough hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my swollen knuckles throbbed. My old rubber wiper blades slapped loudly back and forth across the glass, but they could barely clear the massive sheets of water. I did not take my foot off the gas pedal. My heart was pounding a dark, steady rhythm in my chest, matching the heavy thud of the tires against the flooded pavement. The small green dot on my phone screen had finally stopped moving. It was sitting completely stationary at the very end of an unpaved logging road, deep inside the massive corporate hunting property. I knew this specific land was entirely off the grid. There were no public utility poles out here. There was absolutely zero cell phone service. If I failed today and died out here in the freezing mountain mud, no one would ever find my body. But I did not care about my own life. I only cared about the little girl I had raised. I turned my headlights completely off the exact moment my heavy tires left the paved highway and hit the soft, muddy logging road. I navigated the dangerous path purely by the dim gray light of the storm and the deep, heavy ruts left behind by Buster's flatbed tow truck. The heavy branches of the tall pine trees scraped loudly against the sides of my truck like long, sharp fingernails. I drove another 2 miles deep into the dense, dark woods until I finally saw the shape of a massive log cabin sitting perfectly still in a small clearing. I carefully parked my truck behind a thick cluster of heavy evergreen bushes about 50 yards away from the cabin. I turned the ignition off, and the loud rumbling of my engine was instantly replaced by the deafening roar of the heavy rain hitting the metal roof. I sat in the dark cab for just 1 single second to gather my strength. I did not have a firearm. I only had my heavy canvas work coat and the cold steel tools sitting in the heavy metal toolbox in the bed of my truck. I reached behind my seat and grabbed the heaviest solid steel wrench I owned. It was a massive 2-foot-long heavy-duty pipe wrench that weighed over 8 pounds. I stepped out of my truck and the freezing rain instantly soaked right through my clothing. I moved through the dark, wet woods with the quiet, deliberate steps of a man who knows exactly what is at stake. The thick mud sucked heavily at my heavy work boots, but I kept my balance. I crept up to the side of the massive log cabin, keeping my back pressed tightly against the rough, wet wood. There was a large glass window near the back of the cabin glowing with a warm yellow light. I slowly raised my head and looked inside through the rain-streaked glass. What I saw in that room made my blood run absolutely freezing cold. My daughter Sarah was sitting completely alone in the center of the large, rustic living room. Her hands and feet were bound tightly to a heavy wooden dining chair with thick gray duct tape. Her beautiful face was deeply bruised and swollen on the left side. Her wet hair was plastered to her forehead, and she was shivering violently in the cold room. But her chest was moving up and down. She was breathing. She was still alive. A massive wave of pure, overwhelming relief washed over me so hard it made my bad knees tremble. I had found her. I had actually found my little girl. But as I kept looking through the wet glass, my relief instantly turned into a cold, calculated rage. I looked at the large wooden table sitting directly in front of her. There was a sleek silver laptop glowing brightly on the table, alongside a stack of heavy financial documents and her leather wallet. It all clicked together in my mind with perfect, terrifying clarity. Trent did not try to kill her at the muddy riverbank 2 days ago. He staged the suicide by leaving the car and the note. But he absolutely needed her alive right now. Sarah had a massive inherited family trust fund that required strict dual authentication to transfer any large sums of money. The bank required her specific fingerprint on her personal phone or a direct verbal confirmation password to authorize the complete draining of her accounts. Trent could not steal her family money if she was already dead. He needed her securely hidden away and kept completely alive just long enough for him to force her to authorize the massive wire transfers to his offshore accounts. Once the money was finally cleared and the corrupt judge officially signed her fake death certificate, Trent would simply have Buster bury her deep in these remote woods. It was a perfectly evil financial plan. Suddenly, a heavy wooden door inside the cabin swung open and Buster walked into the living room. He was holding a large red plastic gasoline can in his massive right hand. He walked directly past Sarah without even looking at her. She flinched violently when his heavy boots hit the floorboards, pulling desperately at the thick tape binding her wrists. Buster opened the heavy front door of the cabin and stepped out onto the large covered wooden porch. I ducked quickly back into the dark shadows beneath the window. I watched him closely through the heavy sheets of falling rain. He unscrewed the black plastic cap from the red can and started pouring the raw liquid gasoline directly onto the wooden porch and the thick log walls. The incredibly strong, sharp chemical smell of the fuel instantly cut through the clean smell of the mountain rain. He was not going to bury her. He was going to burn the entire cabin entirely to the ground with my daughter still tied to the chair inside. He would let the massive forest fire destroy all the physical evidence of his crimes. The fire would be so hot there would be absolutely nothing left for the police to find. He was preparing to light the match right now. I knew I had to stop him before he finished soaking the wood. If I simply ran out of the shadows and tried to hit him with my heavy wrench, he would hear my heavy boots splashing in the deep mud. He was a massive, violent man, and he was holding a highly flammable liquid. If we fought on the porch, the gasoline would ignite and the cabin would instantly go up in flames. I needed a massive distraction. I needed to use the one thing I knew better than any man alive. I turned away from the cabin and looked through the heavy rain at his massive flatbed tow truck parked in the gravel driveway. The hood of his truck was facing completely away from the cabin porch. I crouched down incredibly low and moved quickly through the freezing mud until I reached the front bumper of his truck. I slid my cold, wet fingers completely under the heavy metal hood and found the release latch. I popped it open as quietly as I possibly could. The heavy metal creaked softly in the wind. I lifted the heavy hood just enough to slide my thick arms inside the engine bay. The engine was still radiating a massive amount of heat from his fast drive up the mountain. I pulled a small flathead screwdriver from my coat pocket and located the primary fuel pump relay switch mounted near the firewall. Any modern mechanic knows exactly how a fuel injection system works. The engine constantly pumps highly pressurized gasoline straight to the cylinders. If you forcefully bypass the electronic safety relay and deliberately cross the bare copper wires, you can send a massive uncontrolled surge of electricity directly into the pressurized fuel lines. I quickly stripped the thick plastic coating off the main wires using the sharp edge of my screwdriver. I twisted the raw exposed copper wires tightly around the hot positive terminal of the heavy battery. The second he turned the ignition key to start the truck, the massive electrical arc would instantly ignite the completely flooded fuel lines. I did not just disable his truck, I turned his massive heavy-duty diesel engine into a highly explosive bomb. I gently lowered the heavy metal hood back down, making absolutely sure it did not click completely shut. I wiped the thick black grease and the freezing rain from my eyes. I gripped the heavy solid steel pipe wrench tightly with both of my rough hands. The cold metal felt completely natural in my grip. I took one long, deep breath of the freezing mountain air and stepped completely out of the dark shadows. I walked directly into the center of the muddy gravel driveway right in the pouring rain. Buster was just finishing pouring the last few drops of gasoline onto the wooden porch steps. He tossed the empty red plastic can into the wet grass and reached deep into his heavy jacket pocket for a lighter. I hit the side of his truck violently hard with the heavy steel wrench. The loud ringing metallic crash echoed sharply over the sound of the falling rain. Buster spun around violently. He looked through the heavy gray storm and saw me standing entirely alone in the deep mud holding the massive wrench. The total shock on his face only lasted for 1 single second before his dead eyes filled with absolute pure murderous rage. He realized exactly how I had tracked him. He realized I was not the weak, pathetic old fool I pretended to be at his salvage yard. He let out a loud, terrifying roar like a trapped wild animal and charged directly at me through the pouring rain. He was massive and incredibly fast. His heavy work boots kicked up huge chunks of wet mud and gravel as he closed the distance between us. He reached behind his back and pulled out a long, heavy hunting knife. The sharp steel blade gleamed terribly in the dim gray light. I did not back away. I stood my ground, completely planting my heavy boots firmly deep into the soft mud. I waited until he was exactly 2 feet away from me. He lunged violently forward, thrusting the heavy knife directly toward my chest. I twisted my upper body sharply to the left, letting the sharp, cold blade slice right through the thick, wet canvas of my coat, completely missing my flesh. Using the total momentum of his own violent lunge, I swung the massive 8-pound solid steel pipe wrench with every single ounce of strength I had left in my old worn-out body. I aimed perfectly low. The heavy cold steel crashed violently into the side of his right knee. The loud, sickening sound of his thick bone completely shattering cracked sharply through the heavy rain. It sounded exactly like a dry, thick tree branch breaking completely in half. Buster let out a horrific, agonizing scream that tore through the quiet mountains. His right leg folded completely sideways under his massive weight. He collapsed heavily face first into the deep, freezing mud, dropping the sharp hunting knife. He thrashed wildly on the wet ground, clutching his completely destroyed knee, howling in absolute pure agony. He would not be getting back up. I did not wait to watch him suffer. I dropped the heavy steel wrench into the mud and ran directly up the wooden porch steps, completely ignoring the strong fumes of the raw gasoline. I kicked the heavy wooden front door completely open. The door frame splintered loudly as it crashed inward. I rushed into the cold living room. Sarah looked up at me with absolute pure shock in her wide, terrified eyes. She started sobbing instantly, crying out my name through the thick gray duct tape covering her mouth. I fell to my knees beside her heavy chair, pulling a small, sharp utility knife from my pocket. I quickly cut the thick tape from her bruised face and sliced rapidly through the heavy layers binding her wrists and ankles. She fell forward entirely into my arms, weeping violently into my wet canvas coat. I held her incredibly tight, wrapping my thick arms around her shaking shoulders. I told her I had her, and that I was never, ever going to let anyone hurt her again. I pulled her carefully to her feet. She was very weak and completely barefoot. I put my heavy arm firmly around her waist, supporting almost all of her weight. I told her we had to leave right this exact second because the porch was completely soaked in gasoline. I guided her quickly out of the cabin and down the slick wooden steps, carefully stepping over Buster's thrashing, screaming body in the mud. The blinding, freezing rain hit our faces hard as we moved toward the dark tree line where I had safely hidden my truck. We were only 30 yards away from safety. We were almost completely free. But suddenly, a set of blindingly bright white LED headlights cut violently through the dark storm. A massive black luxury SUV turned aggressively off the muddy logging road and pulled directly into the gravel driveway. The heavy vehicle slid slightly in the deep, wet mud before coming to a complete stop directly between us and my hidden truck. The high beams completely blinded me, pinning Sarah and me exactly in the center of the muddy yard like trapped deer. The driver's side door opened slowly. Trent stepped out of his expensive vehicle, perfectly dressed in a dark waterproof jacket, holding a heavy black handgun completely leveled right at my chest. He looked at me, and then he looked at his wife, leaning heavily against my shoulder. He had arrived to finish his terrible work, and he was completely blocking our only way out of the mountains. The heavy rain battered my face as I stood completely frozen in the blinding glare of the bright headlights. Trent stepped out of his massive black luxury vehicle. He looked entirely out of place in the wild, dangerous mountains. He was wearing an expensive waterproof jacket, and his dark hair was perfectly combed. He did not look like a frantic man who had just rushed into a violent, deadly storm to save his family. He looked like a cold, calculating man arriving to close a very dark business deal. But the heavy black handgun gripped tightly in his right hand told a completely different story. He raised the dark weapon and pointed the cold steel barrel directly at the center of my chest. He looked at my face for a long second, and then his dark eyes shifted over to Sarah. He saw the thick-cut duct tape hanging loosely from her pale wrists. He saw the terrible dark purple bruises covering the side of her beautiful face. He instantly knew his entire flawless financial plan was falling apart right in front of his eyes. I moved my heavy body completely in front of my daughter, shielding her from his loaded weapon. I could feel her small, shaking hands gripping the wet canvas of my coat in absolute pure terror. Trent smiled a very small, incredibly cruel smile. He told me I was a very persistent old fool. He calmly said it was a real tragedy that I had tracked her all the way up into these remote mountains just to die in the freezing mud right next to her. He pulled the heavy hammer of the gun back with his thumb. The sharp metallic click was impossibly loud, even over the roaring sound of the massive storm. I knew he was going to pull the trigger. He had absolutely no choice left. But Trent did not know what I was hiding deep inside my left pocket. When Buster had collapsed, screaming in the mud just a few minutes ago, his heavy set of truck keys had fallen right out of his thick jacket. I had snatched them from the wet gravel before running up to the porch to save my daughter. I slowly slipped my rough left hand into my deep coat pocket. My thick, swollen fingers traced the familiar shape of the small plastic remote start key fob. I looked Trent directly in his cold, dead eyes. I told him he was the one who was going to burn today. I pressed my thick thumb down heavily on the remote start button. Behind Trent, the massive diesel engine of Buster's flatbed tow truck instantly tried to crank, but the heavy engine did not turn over normally. The violently bypassed fuel pump relay forced a massive, uncontrolled surge of raw electricity directly into the completely flooded fuel lines. The heavy metal hood of the tow truck blew completely off its steel hinges with a deafening, horrific roar. A massive, blinding ball of bright orange fire erupted violently into the dark night sky. The sheer concussive shockwave of the massive explosion hit us like a solid physical wall of moving air. The incredibly intense heat instantly vaporized the freezing rain all around us. The blast threw Trent completely off his feet. He flew backward through the air like a discarded rag doll and slammed violently face first into the deep, freezing mud. His heavy black handgun spun wildly out of his hand and disappeared forever into the dark, flooded grass. I did not wait for him to recover from the massive shockwave. I grabbed Sarah firmly by the waist and we ran blindly toward the dark, dense tree line. The blazing hot fire from the exploded tow truck cast wild, terrifying shadows across the tall, wet pine trees. We reached my hidden Ford truck and I threw the heavy passenger door wide open. I practically pushed Sarah onto the worn bench seat and slammed the metal door shut. I ran around the front of the truck, slipping heavily in the deep mud, and climbed frantically behind the steering wheel. I jammed my key into the ignition and the old familiar engine roared loudly to life. I threw the heavy gear shift directly into drive and stomped my thick work boot down on the gas pedal. The heavy tires spun violently in the wet mud for one terrifying second before they finally caught solid traction. We tore out of the dark woods, completely bypassing the main muddy logging road. I drove my heavy truck straight through the thick, wild brush, crashing violently over small pine trees and deep rocky ditches. I kept my headlights completely turned off until we were miles away from the burning cabin. I navigated purely by my own memory and the dim gray light of the violent storm. Sarah was shivering completely uncontrollably in the passenger seat. Her bare feet were covered in dark freezing mud and her shaking lips were turning a dangerous shade of pale blue. I reached behind my seat and grabbed a heavy dry wool blanket. I wrapped it tightly around her shaking shoulders and turned the truck heater up as high as it would possibly go. The hot, dry air blasted into the small cab, smelling faintly of old dust and engine oil. I desperately wanted to drive straight down the mountain to the nearest emergency room. I wanted to surround my traumatized little girl with doctors and bright lights and heavily armed hospital security guards. But the cold, hard, terrifying truth settled heavily deep inside my stomach. We could not go to the police, and we absolutely could not go to a public hospital. Trent was incredibly wealthy and deeply connected in our small county. He regularly played golf with the corrupt county judge, and he heavily funded the local police chief's re-election campaigns. If I walked into a brightly lit public hospital, the local police would be called immediately. Trent would use his deep pockets and his expensive corporate lawyers to completely twist the story. He would calmly claim I kidnapped her and beat her. The corrupt police would arrest me on the spot, and Trent would walk right into her private hospital room to easily finish what he started. I had to take her completely off the grid, where his money meant absolutely nothing. I steered my heavy truck entirely away from the main paved highway and headed toward the deep eastern mountains. I was taking her directly to Roy's hidden hunting camp. Roy's camp was absolutely not a luxury vacation home. It was a rugged, bare-bones metal structure hidden deep inside a dense, forgotten valley, entirely inaccessible by normal passenger cars. It took us 2 grueling, exhausting hours of driving slowly through the brutal, freezing storm to finally reach the hidden, washed-out dirt road. When we finally arrived at the camp, the heavy rain had slowed down to a freezing, thick mist. I carried Sarah carefully inside the dark, freezing cabin. There was absolutely no electricity and no running water in the building. I used a heavy cast-iron matches box to carefully light 3 old kerosene lanterns. The warm, yellow light slowly filled the small, quiet room. I quickly built a massive, roaring fire in the heavy iron wood stove, using dry split logs Roy kept stacked neatly in the corner. Within 20 minutes, the small metal cabin was incredibly warm and safe. I boiled some clean bottled water over the hot cast-iron stove and made her a large cup of strong black tea. Sarah sat huddled deeply in a large armchair wrapped tightly in 3 heavy wool blankets. The dark, violent bruises on her beautiful face looked absolutely terrible in the soft, flickering lantern light. I sat completely still on a simple wooden stool right across from her. I told her in a soft, steady voice that she was completely safe now, and that no one in the entire world knew where we were hiding. She took a long, slow, trembling sip of the hot tea. Her shaking hands slowly began to steady as the warm liquid heated her freezing body. She looked at me with heavy tears streaming rapidly down her bruised cheeks, and she finally told me the absolute terrifying truth. Trent was not just struggling with a minor government tax lien like he claimed in my kitchen. He had completely and utterly destroyed his entire financial life. Sarah explained that Trent had secretly embezzled over $4 million from his own wealthy investment clients over the past 3 years. He had used their stolen money to quietly fund a lavish secret lifestyle and massive illegal gambling debts. But his massive, arrogant Ponzi scheme was finally collapsing all around him. A senior investigator from the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission was officially scheduled to conduct a complete forensic audit of his entire firm next week. If the federal auditor found the missing $4 million, Trent would absolutely spend the rest of his natural life inside a federal penitentiary. He was completely trapped and desperately out of time. That was exactly why he bought the $2 million accelerated life insurance policy on my daughter. But the insurance payout was only half of what he desperately needed to avoid federal prison. He also needed total direct access to Sarah's private inherited family trust fund, which securely held another $2 million. He paid Buster $10,000 in clean, untraceable cash to kidnap her from the dark river and hide her deep in the remote woods. Trent planned to force her to authorize the massive trust transfer under the threat of absolute violent torture. Once the massive accounts were fully transferred and the fake life insurance money cleared, the corrupt local judge would finalize the fake death certificate. Trent would easily replace the stolen client funds just days before the federal audit began, and Buster would quietly bury my daughter deep in the muddy mountains where no one would ever find her. The sheer, calculated, cold evil of his massive plan made me completely sick to my stomach. He had planned every single terrible detail with absolute ruthless precision. He was entirely willing to butcher his own loving wife and completely destroy his young children just to save his own skin from a cold jail cell. I let Sarah sleep quietly in the warm cabin while I sat wide awake all night in a heavy wooden chair. I held a rusted heavy hunting rifle I found locked in Roy's metal storage locker. I watched the dark, silent tree line through the small window until the sun finally started to rise over the wet, towering mountains. The violent storm had completely passed, leaving a bitter, freezing cold in the morning air. I walked quietly over to a small battery-powered emergency radio sitting on the wooden kitchen counter. I turned the thick plastic dial to the local news station just to see if there was any early report of the massive fire at the hunting property. The small radio crackled loudly with harsh static before the crisp, urgent voice of a local news anchor filled the small cabin. But the breaking news was absolutely not about a massive fire or destroyed truck. The news anchor loudly announced that a massive statewide emergency manhunt was currently underway. Trent had gone directly to the state police headquarters in the middle of the night. He had filed a frantic, highly emotional emergency missing persons report claiming that his severely mentally unstable and violent father-in-law had violently attacked him in the woods. The news anchor read the official police statement live on the air. Trent told the authorities that I had violently kidnapped Sarah from her home, staged her tragic suicide at the muddy river, and was now holding her completely hostage in the wilderness. My rough face was currently being broadcast across every single television screen and digital highway sign in the entire state. I was now considered a highly dangerous armed and wanted fugitive, and the entire world was actively hunting for me. I sat perfectly still on the hard wooden stool and stared at the small battery-powered radio. The crisp voice of the news anchor echoed through the cold cabin. Trent had not just called the police. He had launched a massive coordinated legal attack. He walked directly into the county courthouse before the sun even came up and filed an emergency guardianship petition. He stood in front of his corrupt friend, Judge Corliss, and told a completely fabricated story that made my blood run cold. Trent claimed that I was suffering from severe advanced dementia. He testified that my mind had completely broken down over the last year. He told the court that I had violently broken into his home, stolen his expensive leather briefcase, and then wandered out into the dangerous woods with his severely depressed and suicidal wife. It was a brilliantly evil legal maneuver. By having me officially declared mentally incompetent and highly dangerous, Trent accomplished 3 terrible things all at once. First, he completely discredited anything I might say if I was ever caught. If I tried to tell the police about the $10,000 check or the corrupt salvage yard owner, they would just ignore me as a crazy old man having a dementia episode. Second, he convinced the corrupt judge to immediately freeze every single one of my personal bank accounts. My retirement fund, my checking account, and even the small savings account I had set up for my grandchildren were completely locked. I could not access a single penny to buy food, gas, or medicine. I was entirely cut off from the modern world. But the third thing he accomplished was the absolute worst of all. Trent used the emergency guardianship order to secure temporary absolute custody of my 2 young grandchildren. The radio announcer stated that the children had been removed from their school and were currently being held in a secure, undisclosed location under Trent's direct control. A heavy, sickening wave of pure terror washed over me. Those little kids were entirely at the mercy of a ruthless man who had just tried to murder their own mother. I gripped the edge of the wooden table so hard my swollen knuckles cracked in the quiet room. Sarah let out a soft, heartbroken sob from her chair by the wood stove. She pulled the heavy wool blankets tighter around her shaking shoulders and buried her bruised face in her hands. She was terrified for her babies, and I was terrified for her. The news report continued with even more devastating information. Because I was now officially classified as an armed and highly dangerous fugitive, the state police had formed a heavily armed tactical team. Just 1 hour ago, they had completely raided my empty house back in town. The reporter described how the tactical officers had kicked my heavy wooden front door completely off its iron hinges. They threw flash grenades into my quiet living room and tore through my personal belongings, searching for any clue to my whereabouts. They ripped apart the house where I had raised my family. They destroyed the peaceful, quiet sanctuary I had built with my own 2 calloused hands. Trent had successfully turned the entire massive weight of the American legal system directly against me. He firmly believed he had backed me into a dark corner where I would quickly starve, freeze, or simply surrender to the police. Trent was an incredibly wealthy and highly educated man. He wore tailored suits and drove German luxury cars. He thought because I wore stained canvas coats and drove a rusted Ford truck that I was completely ignorant. He thought I was just a dumb old diesel mechanic who only knew how to turn a wrench. But he fundamentally misunderstood exactly what a mechanic actually does. A good mechanic never just smashes a broken machine with a heavy hammer. A master mechanic knows how to carefully study a massive, complex system. We look for the absolute weakest bolt. We find the single tiny stripped wire that controls the entire massive engine. And then we calmly and methodically dismantle the entire machine piece by piece until there is nothing left but a pile of useless scrap metal. Trent was a massive corrupt engine, and I knew exactly how to take him completely apart. I turned the emergency radio off. The small metal cabin fell completely silent except for the soft crackling of the dry wood burning in the cast iron stove. I walked over to Roy, who was sitting quietly at the small kitchen counter. Roy had spent his entire 30 years career as a forensic accountant for the state police. He knew exactly how the massive federal financial agencies worked, and he knew exactly how to destroy a corrupt broker. I told Roy that we could not fight Trent in the local county court. Trent owned the local police and he owned the local judge. We had to take the fight to a battlefield where Trent had absolutely zero control. We had to bring down the massive, crushing weight of the federal government directly onto his head. I walked over to Sarah and knelt down gently beside her chair. I put my rough, warm hands over her cold, trembling fingers. I asked her if she could remember any of the specific details about the stolen client money she had found on Trent's laptop before he hired Buster to kidnap her. Sarah took a long, deep breath and wiped the heavy tears from her bruised face. My daughter is an incredibly intelligent woman. She inherited my sharp memory for complex numbers and details. She closed her eyes and began to speak slowly. She remembered the exact name of the offshore holding company Trent had created in the Cayman Islands. She remembered the specific dates of the massive $4 million wire transfers. And most importantly, she had memorized the exact 12-digit routing number for the hidden offshore account. Roy wrote every single word down on a small yellow notepad with a completely steady hand. He looked at the numbers, and a slow, grim smile spread across his weathered face. He said this was not just a smoking gun. This was the exact bullet that would put Trent in a federal prison for the rest of his natural life. But we could not use my cell phone or Roy's cell phone to make the call. The state police were undoubtedly tracking our digital signals right now. If we turned our phones on for even 1 single minute, the heavily armed tactical teams would completely swarm our hidden cabin. Roy stood up and grabbed his heavy hunting coat. He said he knew a small independent gas station about 20 miles away on a forgotten dirt road. It was run by an old man who did not ask any questions and only accepted cash. Roy said he was going to buy 3 cheap prepaid burner phones and he would be back before noon. Roy returned exactly 2 hours later, completely soaked from the freezing mountain mist. He placed 3 cheap plastic cell phones onto the wooden table. He quickly activated one of the phones using a fake name and a random zip code. He did not call the local police. He did not call the county sheriff. Roy dialed the direct, unlisted office number of the senior auditor at the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission in Atlanta. This was the exact same federal investigator who was already scheduled to conduct a routine audit of Trent's investment firm next week. Roy put the cheap phone on speaker and set it down heavily on the table. A cold, professional voice answered on the 3rd ring. Roy did not introduce himself. He spoke in a low, calm, entirely disguised voice. He told the federal agent that he had highly sensitive, irrefutable proof of a massive ongoing financial fraud at Trent's investment firm. The federal agent sounded incredibly skeptical at first. People call federal agencies with crazy conspiracy theories every single day. The agent rudely asked Roy for his name and told him to file a standard complaint online, but Roy calmly interrupted him. Roy slowly and deliberately read the 12-digit offshore routing number aloud. He gave the agent the exact name of the shell company in the Cayman Islands. He provided the exact dates and the exact massive dollar amounts of the stolen client funds. The line went completely dead silent. The heavy skepticism in the federal agent's voice instantly vanished. When the agent finally spoke again, his voice was incredibly sharp and deeply urgent. He demanded to know how Roy had obtained this highly classified internal banking information. Roy simply told the agent to look at his own digital ledgers and cross-reference the numbers. Roy said the $4 million was completely gone, and Trent was desperately trying to replace it before the audit next week. Roy told the agent that if the federal government did not freeze Trent's corporate accounts immediately, the money would be permanently lost, and hundreds of innocent working-class clients would lose their entire life savings. Then Roy simply ended the call and removed the small battery from the cheap plastic phone. The trap was officially set. We did not have to wait very long to see the massive results of our work. Just 3 hours later, I turned the small emergency radio back on to listen to the afternoon news broadcast. The local news anchor sounded completely shocked. The massive manhunt for me was no longer the top story. The anchor announced that a massive team of federal agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission had just raided the towering glass headquarters of Trent's investment firm in downtown Atlanta. The federal agents had completely seized all the corporate computers, locked the heavy glass doors, and officially frozen every single corporate bank account tied to Trent's name. The entire massive financial empire Trent had built on lies was rapidly crumbling to the ground. Trent was now a completely desperate, cornered animal. He could no longer replace the $4 million he had violently stolen from his clients. The federal government was heavily scrutinizing his every single move. The only possible way he could avoid a massive 25-year federal prison sentence was to physically get his hands on the $2 million accelerated life insurance payout and instantly flee the country. But to get that massive check, he absolutely needed the official death certificate finalized by the corrupt judge. And he needed it right now before the federal agents obtained a warrant for his personal arrest. Through Roy's deep backdoor connections in the state database, we discovered Trent's final desperate move. Trent had just scheduled a highly secretive emergency closed-door meeting with the senior executives of the Chicago Life Insurance Company and his high-priced probate lawyers. The private meeting was officially set for Friday afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock inside his towering downtown office building. Trent fully intended to walk into that boardroom, hand the executives the corrupt judge's final death declaration, and walk out with a $2 million cashier check. He thought he had completely won. He thought I was hiding terrified in the freezing mud. He had absolutely no idea that I was going to walk right through those heavy boardroom doors and tear his entire world completely apart. I sat perfectly still in the cold metal cabin and stared at the cheap plastic clock ticking loudly on the wall. It was Thursday night, and the darkness outside the small window was completely absolute. We had less than 24 hours before Trent walked into that high-rise boardroom to steal my daughter's entire life. I knew exactly what I had to do, but the sheer, terrifying weight of it made my old chest ache with a deep, heavy pressure. I had to walk directly into the absolute heart of the lion's den. I was currently the most wanted man in the entire state of Georgia. My face was being broadcast on every single local news channel and electronic highway sign. If I walked through the bright glass doors of Trent's corporate office building, the security guards would likely recognize me instantly. The local police would be heavily armed and called to the scene within minutes. I would be violently thrown to the cold marble floor, handcuffed and dragged away to a holding cell. If that happened, I would lose absolutely everything. I would be locked away in a concrete box while Trent deposited a $2 million check and immediately boarded a private chartered flight out of the country with my 2 beautiful grandchildren. I would never ever see those little kids again. But if I stayed safely hidden up in this remote mountain cabin and did absolutely nothing, Trent would win anyway. A father does not hide in the shadows when his family is standing on the edge of a dangerous cliff. A father stands up and steps directly into the line of heavy fire. I turned away from the window and told Sarah my final plan. She was sitting by the warm cast-iron stove holding a chipped mug of hot tea. Her beautiful face was still terribly bruised and heavily swollen from the violent attack, but the absolute pure terror in her eyes from yesterday had completely vanished. It was entirely replaced by a hardened, cold steel resolve. She looked exactly like her late mother in that exact moment. I told her I absolutely could not bring her into the city with me. It was far too dangerous for her to be seen before the trap was fully sprung. If things went violently wrong and I was arrested, she needed to stay completely hidden so she could fight for her children from the shadows with the evidence we gathered. But I told her I desperately needed her voice in that boardroom. I needed the corrupt executives to see her face. Roy quietly pulled his heavy encrypted black laptop from his canvas bag and balanced it carefully on a wooden crate in the center of the room. He turned on the high-definition web camera mounted at the top of the screen. Sarah set her tea down and sat up perfectly straight in her wooden chair. She did not try to hide her injuries. She pushed her tangled, unwashed hair entirely away from her battered face, showing the terrible dark purple bruises directly to the glass lens. Roy pressed the small red record button. My daughter looked directly into the camera and spoke with an incredible absolute strength that made my old heart swell with pure, immense pride. She clearly stated her full legal name. She stated the current date and the exact time of the recording. She calmly looked into the lens and detailed every single terrifying moment of the last 3 days. She explained exactly how her husband had hired a violent convicted felon named Buster Hayes to violently drag her from her car. She explained the forged suicide note left on the muddy dashboard. She detailed the exact offshore bank accounts Trent was desperately trying to use to hide his stolen $4 million in client money. She completely and utterly dismantled his entire fake grieving widower routine. She laid bare every single lie he had told the police and the corrupt judge. When she finally finished speaking, she leaned slightly closer to the camera. Her voice dropped to a cold, absolute whisper. She looked straight into the lens and said, "I am absolutely not dead, Trent, and you are never touching my children again." Roy quickly transferred the high-definition video file onto a small silver USB drive. Now it was finally time for me to assemble my physical weapons. I did not have a shotgun or a hunting rifle. I had something far more dangerous and destructive to a corrupt man wearing a tailored suit. I had an irrefutable paper trail. I took the original heavy Italian leather briefcase Trent had stupidly left sitting on my kitchen island. I carefully placed the original freshly signed will back inside the dark leather pockets. I added the massive $2 million accelerated life insurance policy right next to it. Then Roy handed me a thick stack of newly printed papers. He had used a small portable printer connected to his laptop to run off high-resolution copies of the $10,000 personal check. The printed pages clearly showed Trent's messy signature, endorsing the money directly over to the salvage yard owned by the convicted felon. Below that, Roy included the exact federal audit file numbers from the Securities and Exchange Commission. He included the digital wiretap data and the offshore routing numbers, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the $4 million of client funds were completely missing. I placed every single damning document neatly into the heavy leather briefcase and snapped the thick brass buckles securely shut. I was fully heavily armed, but I knew I could not walk into a downtown corporate high-rise wearing a filthy wet canvas work coat and muddy steel toe boots. If I looked like a homeless mechanic, the building security guards would tackle me before I even reached the lobby elevator banks. Roy opened his heavy canvas duffel bag and pulled out a dark charcoal gray suit. He had bought it with cash at a cheap department store along with the burner phones earlier that morning. It was absolutely not a perfect custom fit, but it was clean and deeply pressed. I stripped off my dirty-smelling work clothes and put the dark suit on. I buttoned the crisp white shirt and pulled the heavy jacket over my broad, thick shoulders. I looked at my reflection in the small, cracked mirror hanging on the wooden cabin wall. I looked like a completely different man. I looked like a wealthy, older investor. But when I looked down at my hands sticking out of the clean white cuffs, I saw the deep, permanent black grease stains worked into my skin, and the thick, swollen arthritic knuckles from 40 years of turning heavy wrenches. I was wearing the slick, deceptive armor of a corporate broker, but underneath the cheap synthetic fabric, I was still just a heavy-duty diesel mechanic ready to tear a corrupt machine completely apart piece by piece. Friday afternoon finally arrived with a heavy, thick gray sky hanging low over the massive, sprawling city of Atlanta. It was exactly 2:50 in the afternoon. The loud downtown streets were incredibly crowded with busy people rushing back to their offices after their lunch breaks. I stepped out of a yellow taxi cab exactly 1 full block away from Trent's towering glass office building. The massive skyscraper reached impossibly high into the dark clouds. It was a giant, intimidating fortress of cold steel and mirrored glass specifically designed to make working-class people feel incredibly small and entirely insignificant. I gripped the heavy leather handle of the briefcase incredibly tightly in my right hand. I took one last deep, long breath of the thick city air mixed with car exhaust and started walking directly toward the main entrance. I kept my head down slightly, letting the brim of a dark gray fedora hat safely cover the upper half of my face to hide from the street cameras. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped directly into the massive, cavernous lobby. The floors were highly polished white marble and the towering walls were covered in expensive modern art. The air inside was perfectly cool and smelled faintly of expensive cleaning chemicals and wealthy cologne. Directly in the center of the massive lobby was a large circular security desk manned by 3 uniformed guards. They were closely checking employee identification badges and monitoring dozens of live camera feeds on flat screens. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but I forced my heavy legs to move with absolute smooth, effortless confidence. I knew from a lifetime of experience that a man who looks like he completely belongs is almost never questioned. I kept my rough face turned slightly away from the bright overhead lights and walked directly past the security desk, completely blending in with a large group of laughing young executives returning from a long lunch. The security guards did not even look up from their computer screens. I reached the polished silver elevator banks and pressed the glowing up button. The heavy metal doors slid silently open and I stepped inside, joining 3 other people in suits. I pressed the small glowing button for the 14th floor. The elevator began to rise rapidly and smoothly, carrying me up directly into the absolute heart of the enemy's territory. The digital red numbers above the door counted up incredibly quickly. 10, 11, 12, 13. I knew exactly what was waiting for me on the other side of those metal doors. Through Roy's deep backdoor digital surveillance, we knew Trent had specifically hired a private armed security firm for this incredibly sensitive emergency meeting. He was taking absolutely no chances while the federal government was breathing heavily down his neck. There were going to be highly trained, aggressive men with loaded weapons standing guard right outside the room. The digital numbers flashed to 14. The elevator slowed down gracefully and came to a completely smooth, silent stop. The other people had already gotten off on lower floors, so I was entirely alone in the small metal box. I tightened my thick, swollen grip on the heavy leather briefcase until my knuckles turned completely white. I squared my broad, heavy shoulders and completely prepared myself physically and mentally for the extreme violence that might follow. The silver doors slid open, revealing a long, quiet hallway lined with plush, thick gray carpet and expensive wooden wall paneling. Standing directly in front of the heavy, solid oak double doors of the main executive boardroom at the end of the hall were 3 massive private security guards. They were wearing identical dark-tailored suits and clear plastic earpieces. Their hands were resting comfortably but very deliberately near the heavy black handguns securely holstered at their hips. They saw the elevator doors open, and all 3 sets of cold eyes locked instantly onto me. I did not pause. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I stepped entirely out of the elevator and walked straight down the long, silent hallway toward them. I did not stop walking. The 3 massive security guards standing outside the heavy oak double doors immediately tensed up when they saw me coming down the long, quiet hallway. They raised their thick hands and firmly ordered me to halt. They told me this floor was completely closed for a private corporate meeting. I did not say a single word to them. I kept my head down slightly, letting the brim of my dark hat hide my face. I walked with the heavy, undeniable momentum of a massive diesel truck rolling downhill. Before the guards could fully realize that I was completely ignoring their verbal commands, I stepped right between them. I reached out with both of my rough hands and grabbed the heavy, polished brass handles of the double boardroom doors. I did not just push the doors open. I threw my entire massive body weight against the heavy oak wood. The doors flew violently inward with a deafening explosive crack that echoed like a gunshot through the quiet corporate floor. The heavy wood slammed violently against the interior walls of the boardroom, shaking the expensive framed artwork. I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the absolute center of the room. The massive executive boardroom was incredibly silent. The entire outer wall was made of towering floor-to-ceiling glass windows offering a sweeping panoramic view of the dark, stormy Atlanta skyline. In the direct center of the room sat a massive custom-built mahogany conference table completely covered by a thick sheet of protective glass. Sitting exactly at the head of the long table was Trent. He was wearing an incredibly sharp black morning suit. His dark hair was perfectly styled, but he was putting on a truly disgusting theatrical performance. He was holding a crisp white handkerchief over his mouth, and his shoulders were trembling as if he was violently sobbing. Sitting directly across from him were two older men in conservative gray suits. They were the senior claims adjusters from the Chicago Life Insurance Company. Between them on the polished glass table sat the incredibly thick stacks of finalized legal paperwork. Right at the very top of the stack, I could clearly see the bright blue ink of Judge Corliss officially declaring my daughter legally dead. One of the insurance executives was holding a beautiful gold fountain pen. He was holding the pen directly over a pristine certified corporate cashier check made out for exactly $2 million. He was just seconds away from signing his name and handing my daughter's life away to a violent monster. When the heavy oak doors crashed open, the entire room completely froze. The gold fountain pen stopped entirely in midair. The two insurance executives spun around in their heavy leather chairs, staring at me in absolute total shock. Trent slowly lowered the white handkerchief from his face. He looked down the long length of the mahogany table directly at me. It took his brain one full second to process exactly what he was looking at. He recognized my broad, heavy shoulders. He recognized the rough, calloused hands sticking out of the cheap gray suit. When he realized that the old senile mechanic he thought was hiding, freezing in the remote mountains, was standing directly inside his highly secure corporate fortress. The entire color instantly drained completely out of his face. He turned the absolute pale, terrifying white of a fresh ghost. His perfectly constructed mask of the grieving, heartbroken widower completely evaporated in less than a second. Absolute, pure, panicked terror flooded his dark eyes. He leaped out of his heavy leather chair, knocking it violently backward onto the expensive carpet. He pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my chest and began to scream at the absolute top of his lungs. "Security!" He screamed, his voice cracking with pure raw panic. "Get him out of here right now. That is him. That is the crazy old man I told the police about. He is the highly dangerous, delusional kidnapper who took my wife. He is absolutely insane. Grab him before he hurts somebody." The three massive security guards from the hallway rushed violently into the room right behind me. Two of them grabbed my arms with incredible, brutal force. They were large, strong men, and their thick fingers dug painfully deep into my biceps through the fabric of my suit jacket. They violently jerked my arms completely behind my back, trying to force me down onto the carpet. I did not fight them. I did not throw a single punch or try to wrestle my way out of their heavy iron grips. I am an old man with bad knees, and I knew I could never win a physical street fight against three trained guards, but I did not need to fight them with my fists. I anchored my heavy work boots completely flat into the thick carpet and locked my heavy legs using my sheer physical mass to stay perfectly upright. With my right hand still gripping the heavy leather handle, I swung my arm violently forward before the guards could completely pin it behind my back. I threw the thick, heavy Italian leather briefcase directly down the long length of the mahogany table. The heavy metal buckles scraped loudly against the thick protective glass surface. The dark briefcase slid with incredible speed directly toward Trent. It smashed violently into his ceramic coffee mug sitting near the legal papers. The heavy mug shattered into dozens of sharp white pieces, sending hot, black coffee spraying completely across the polished table and directly onto the finalized death certificate. "You forgot your briefcase, Trent," I said. My deep, rough voice boomed incredibly loud, echoing off the glass walls, filling every single corner of the massive room. I did not yell. I spoke with the terrifying, heavy, absolute authority of a father who had just walked completely through the fires of hell. The two insurance executives jumped up from their chairs, completely alarmed by the violently shattered coffee mug and the loud confrontation. The guards were still twisting my arms painfully behind my back, shouting at me to stop resisting. I completely ignored the physical pain in my shoulders. I stared dead straight into Trent's panicked eyes. "I told you to take care of my little girl, Trent," I said, my voice completely steady and cold. But instead you bought a $2 million accelerated life insurance policy on her life completely in secret. You paid a convicted violent felon $10,000 to violently drag her out of her car in the middle of the night. You left her grandmother's broken watch in the mud so the police would think she jumped off that bridge. Trent was breathing incredibly fast now. He looked like a trapped animal desperately looking for an open window. "Shut up!" he screamed wildly, trying to wave the security guards forward. "Do not listen to a single word he says. The state police are looking for him right now. He has completely lost his mind to dementia. Take him to the ground and put the handcuffs on him immediately." But the insurance executives did not move. They were highly trained corporate investigators who spent their entire lives looking for financial fraud. When I mentioned the exact specific type of life insurance policy they had literally brought to the table today, their professional curiosity instantly overpowered their fear of the shouting guards. The older executive, wearing the gold wire-rimmed glasses, held up his hand demanding the security guards stop for just one moment. He looked cautiously down at the heavy dark leather briefcase sitting in the puddle of spilled coffee. I violently jerked my right shoulder forward, breaking the grip of the guard holding my arm just long enough to reach my hand out. "Open the briefcase, gentlemen," I commanded loudly. The older executive hesitated for one single second before he reached out and snapped the heavy brass buckles open. He pulled the thick stack of papers out of the leather pockets. "Read the first page aloud to the room," I demanded, keeping my eyes locked entirely on Trent. Trent's face was covered in a thick layer of nervous sweat. He lunged forward over the table, trying to desperately snatch the papers away, but the second insurance executive firmly blocked his hand. The older executive pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and looked down at the freshly printed papers Roy and I had meticulously prepared. I began to speak entirely from memory, reading the exact timeline of his massive fraud aloud to the entire room, while the executive verified every single word with his own 2 eyes. "2 days ago, you came to my house begging for $10,000 in cash," I said, my deep voice cutting completely through the tension in the room. "You told me it was to pay an emergency federal tax lien to save your house. But right there in your hands, gentlemen, is the exact printed copy of that check. Look at the endorsement on the back. He did not pay the government. He signed my personal money directly over to a commercial shell company called Iron City Salvage, a dirty scrapyard owned entirely by Vance Buster Hayes, a man with 2 severe felony convictions for armed extortion and aggravated assault. That is the man he hired to execute his wife." The insurance executives stared at the copied check in absolute stunned silence. They flipped to the next page. "But you want to know exactly why he needed the $2 million today?" I continued, raising my voice even louder, so the guards holding my arms could hear every single word. "Look at the third document in that stack. That is a highly classified internal federal wiretap intercept from the Securities and Exchange Commission in Atlanta. Trent did not just lose his own money. He systematically embezzled over $4 million from his own wealthy working-class clients over the last 3 years. He wired every single stolen penny into a massive offshore shell company located in the Cayman Islands." The older executive gasped quietly as he read the exact routing numbers and the massive missing dollar amounts printed clearly on the page. "The federal auditors are officially coming to investigate this firm next week," I said, pointing my rough finger directly at Trent's trembling chest. "If they look at his ledgers and see the $4 million is missing, he goes directly to federal prison for 25 years. So he desperately needed $2 million from you today. And he needed another $2 million directly from my daughter's private family trust fund. He needed the cash right now to replace the stolen money before the federal government locked him in a concrete cage. He forged a suicide note and paid a violent thug to torture my daughter in a remote hunting cabin until she gave up her passwords. He is not a grieving widower. He is a pathetic, desperate thief who tried to murder the mother of his own children just to save his own miserable skin." The boardroom was so completely silent you could hear the rain hitting the glass windows. The insurance executive slowly backed away from Trent, looking at him as if he was entirely covered in a highly contagious, deadly disease. They slowly placed the cap back onto the gold fountain pen. They were absolutely not going to sign that massive check. They had seen the absolute irrefutable proof of his massive financial crimes. I stood incredibly tall between the massive security guards, waiting for Trent to completely break down and confess to his horrible sins. I waited for him to fall to his knees and beg the room for mercy. But Trent did not fall to his knees. The absolute pure, panicked terror in his dark eyes slowly vanished. It was entirely replaced by something far more dangerous. He stood up completely straight, smoothing the wrinkles out of his expensive black suit jacket. He looked down at the spilled coffee and the ruined death certificate on the glass table. And then a low, dark, terrible sound completely filled the quiet boardroom. Trent started to laugh. It was a cold, cruel, deeply arrogant laugh that echoed off the glass walls and sent a massive chill entirely down my spine. He shook his head slowly, wiping a single tear of laughter from his eye. He looked over at the two terrified insurance executives and smiled his slick, expensive corporate smile. "Gentlemen, I am so incredibly sorry you had to witness this deeply tragic spectacle today," Trent said, his smooth voice completely steady again. "Look at this poor, sad, deranged old man. He is entirely broken. My beautiful wife took her own life 3 days ago, and her father simply cannot handle the profound grief. His mind has completely snapped. He broke into my house, stole my personal briefcase, and spent the last 48 hours making up wild psychotic conspiracy theories in the woods." Trent walked slowly around the edge of the mahogany table, stepping completely closer to me. He looked me dead in the eyes with absolute pure evil confidence. He knew he still had the upper hand. He still had the corrupt judge in his pocket. He still had the state police searching for me. And most importantly, he still had total legal custody of my grandchildren. "None of those papers mean absolutely anything," Trent whispered coldly. "They are just printed garbage from a delusional armed fugitive. You have absolutely no proof that she was murdered. You have no proof she was kidnapped. Because you do not have her body. She is dead, Walter. She is gone forever, and you are going to spend the rest of your pathetic life locked inside a padded cell." Trent turned his back to me and looked directly at the massive head security guard. He snapped his manicured fingers sharply. "This man is a highly dangerous wanted fugitive," Trent ordered coldly. "Put him in handcuffs right now and drag him down to the lobby. Call the state police." The massive guard holding my left arm nodded his head. I felt the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs press violently against my rough wrist. The heavy metal ratchet clicked sharply, locking tightly into place over my skin. Trent smiled a massive, victorious smile, believing he had finally won the entire brutal war. The heavy, cold steel of the handcuffs bit deeply and painfully into the raw skin of my thick wrists. The massive private security guard standing directly behind me cranked the metal ratchet one final time, making absolutely sure the steel teeth locked perfectly into place over my bones. My heavy arms were violently jerked completely behind my back, forcing my broad chest forward and throwing me slightly off balance. The sharp, agonizing pain flared directly through my old arthritic shoulders, but I absolutely refused to flinch. I stood completely, perfectly straight, keeping my boots planted firmly into the expensive plush carpet of the executive boardroom. I kept my eyes locked directly onto Trent. Trent stood safely at the head of the massive mahogany table, completely surrounded by the shattered pieces of his ceramic coffee mug. He reached his manicured hands up and slowly smoothed out the lapels of his expensive, custom-tailored black suit. He took a long, deep breath and let out a dramatic, heavy sigh, playing the absolute perfect role of the exhausted, heartbroken victim. He looked across the glass table at the two terrified insurance executives and shook his head with a pathetic fake sorrow. He apologized profusely for the chaotic, violent interruption, claiming he had absolutely no idea his deeply deranged father-in-law would violently break into a secure corporate building. He smoothly reached down and picked up the heavy gold fountain pen from the glass table. He carefully wiped a few dark drops of spilled coffee off the solid gold barrel using a crisp white napkin. He looked directly at me with a sickening, arrogant smirk plastered entirely across his pale face. He truly, completely believed he had just won the entire brutal war. He firmly believed the corrupt local police were going to drag me away to a dark concrete cell while he casually deposited a $2 million check and fled the country with my precious grandchildren. "Take this sad old man down to the psych ward," Trent sneered, waving his hand dismissively toward the heavy broken oak doors. "Call the county sheriff and tell them the fugitive they have been hunting all day just walked right into our lobby. Tell them he is highly dangerous and completely delusional. Get him entirely out of my sight right now so I can finally finish putting my tragic wife to rest." The two massive security guards grabbed me incredibly roughly by the heavy fabric of my suit jacket. They began physically pushing my heavy body toward the open doorway. I did not physically struggle against their heavy grips. I did not shout or curse at Trent. I just kept my eyes entirely open and waited. I knew the trap was already fully set. I knew the incredibly heavy weight of the federal government was already completely inside the building. The security guards pushed me exactly 3 steps toward the hallway, and then the tense, heavy silence of the massive corporate floor was completely and utterly shattered. "He is not going anywhere, Trent." A clear, absolute voice echoed down the long, quiet, carpeted hallway. It was not a loud shout, it was not a violent scream, but the voice carried a massive, terrifying, undeniable authority that completely froze the entire room in a single fraction of a second. The security guards holding my arms stopped entirely dead in their tracks. Their heavy hands loosened slightly on my shoulders. Trent froze, completely solid, with the gold fountain pen hovering exactly 1 single inch above the pristine $2 million cashier check. The two older insurance executives turned their heads incredibly slowly toward the broken oak double doors. The air inside the massive boardroom suddenly felt incredibly cold and terribly thin. And then, my beautiful, brave daughter stepped directly through the broken wooden doorway and walked straight into the bright overhead light of the executive boardroom. The two insurance executives gasped loudly in absolute pure terror and total shock. They stumbled violently backward away from the glass table, knocking their heavy leather chairs completely over onto the floor. They looked wildly down at the freshly printed signed death certificate covered in spilled black coffee, and then they looked directly up at the living, breathing woman standing right in front of them. Sarah looked completely and utterly battered, but she stood impossibly tall. The heavy, violent trauma of the last 3 days was clearly visible all over her body. Her left arm was securely strapped tight against her chest in a thick, dark medical sling. The entire left side of her beautiful face was covered in terrible, deep purple and yellow bruises from where Buster had violently struck her in the muddy woods. She was wearing a simple, oversized gray sweater we had bought at the rural gas station, and her hair was still tangled and unwashed. She did not look like the polished, wealthy corporate wife Trent always demanded her to be. She looked exactly like a fierce, hardened survivor who had just walked completely through the fires of hell and absolutely refused to burn. She walked past the massive security guards with an incredible, heavy, silent grace. She did not even look at the armed men who were holding my arms. She kept her completely unbroken gaze locked entirely onto the man who had tried to brutally end her life. Trent physically stopped breathing. The total, absolute, pure terror that washed over his pale face in that exact moment is something I will clearly remember with deep, profound satisfaction for the rest of my natural life. His dark, arrogant eyes bulged wildly out of his head. His jaw dropped completely open, but absolutely no sound came out of his throat. He looked at Sarah as if he was staring directly at a terrifying, vengeful ghost rising straight up from a muddy grave. The heavy gold fountain pen slipped completely through his trembling, manicured fingers. It hit the thick glass table with a sharp, loud metallic clatter and rolled slowly off the edge, dropping heavily onto the carpeted floor. Trent tried to take a step backward, but his expensive leather shoes slipped violently on the polished floor. His legs completely and utterly gave out beneath his own heavy weight. He stumbled wildly backward, throwing his arms out to catch himself. He crashed incredibly hard against the massive, thick glass whiteboard mounted entirely on the back wall of the boardroom. The heavy impact rattled the thick glass violently. He slid slowly down the smooth glass surface until his knees hit the floor. He crouched there completely destroyed, shaking violently, uncontrollably. The slick, arrogant investment broker was entirely gone. He was nothing more than a pathetic, broken coward staring at the massive, horrifying reality of his own absolute destruction. He tried to speak, but his voice was nothing more than a weak, wet, completely broken whisper. "Sarah," he choked out desperately, holding his shaking hands up toward her. "Sarah, please." Sarah did not stop walking until she was standing exactly 2 feet away from his trembling, pathetic body. She looked directly down at him with a cold, absolute total hatred that burned brighter than any fire I had ever seen. "You could not even get murder right, Trent," she said, her voice completely steady and ringing with absolute pure steel. The second those words left her mouth, the heavy sound of synchronized, purposeful footsteps echoed loudly from the hallway. Stepping directly out of the dark shadows behind Sarah were 2 massive men in dark navy windbreakers. Stenciled across the back and front of their heavy jackets in large, bright yellow letters were the 3 most terrifying initials a corrupt financial broker could ever possibly see: FBI. These were absolutely not the corrupt local county police officers Trent had bought and paid for over the years. These were senior federal agents from the massive federal task force that had just completely raided his firm downstairs. They had found the missing $4 million. They had tracked the offshore accounts. And they had listened to the entire video confession Sarah had recorded in the mountain cabin just a few hours ago. The lead federal agent stepped aggressively into the boardroom, completely bypassing the confused private security guards. The federal agent did not ask for permission to enter. He did not care about the corporate meeting. He walked directly toward Trent, who was still cowering heavily against the glass whiteboard. Trenton Hayes, the federal agent, said in a loud, booming, completely authoritative voice, "You are under immediate federal arrest for massive wire fraud, felony embezzlement, interstate kidnapping, and the attempted murder of your wife." Trent completely lost his mind. The final absolute reality of his entire life collapsing crushed him violently. He started crying hysterically. Real, massive, ugly tears poured rapidly down his pale face, completely ruining his expensive appearance. He fell forward onto his hands and knees, completely destroying his tailored suit pants. He reached his shaking hands out and desperately tried to grab the bottom edge of Sarah's gray sweater. "Sarah, please tell them it was not me," he sobbed violently, spitting completely frantically as he spoke. "It was Buster. The scrapyard owner did it. Buster went crazy. He kidnapped you and tried to extort me for the money. I was trying to pay him off to save your life. You have to believe me, Sarah. I love you. I love our children. Please do not let them take me away." Sarah did not even flinch. She simply took one completely calm, deliberate step backward, moving entirely out of his desperate reach. She looked down at him as if he was a disgusting insect completely crushed on the bottom of her shoe. The two federal agents moved in with aggressive lightning speed. They completely ignored his pathetic, hysterical lies. The lead agent grabbed Trent roughly by the thick collar of his expensive silk suit and violently hauled his heavy body up off the carpet. The second agent grabbed Trent's violently flailing arms and forcefully twisted them completely behind his back with incredible brutal efficiency. The satisfying metallic sound of heavy federal steel handcuffs ratcheting incredibly tight around Trent's wrists echoed loudly throughout the massive, quiet boardroom. It was the absolute sweetest music I had ever heard in my entire long life. Trent was completely sobbing uncontrollably now. His perfectly combed dark hair was hanging completely wildly in his wet, terrified face. He was loudly begging the federal agents to look at the forged suicide note. He was completely hysterically begging the two paralyzed insurance executives to call his high-priced corporate lawyers. But absolutely no one in the room moved a single inch to help him. The insurance executives were rapidly, aggressively backing entirely away from the table, completely horrified that they had almost handed $2 million to a violent federal criminal. The security guard standing behind me immediately pulled a small silver key from his belt and quickly unlocked the heavy cuffs binding my wrists. The heavy steel fell completely away from my arms. I slowly rubbed my raw, aching wrists, bringing my heavy hands back around to my chest. I took a very deep, long breath of the cool, filtered air, feeling completely and utterly free for the absolute first time in 3 terrifying days. The two massive federal agents completely dragged Trent, kicking and screaming violently toward the heavy, broken oak doors. Trent looked back over his shoulder, his face completely twisted in pure, absolute terror and pathetic desperation. He locked eyes with me one final time before the agents pushed him out the door. He finally saw the complete, absolute truth. He realized that the quiet working-class mechanic he had constantly mocked and underestimated his entire life was the exact man who had completely and utterly destroyed him. The agents dragged Trent directly down the long, carpeted hallway. Through the broken doors, I watched them force him into the open glass elevator. They did not take him out through a quiet, private back door. The federal agents completely intentionally dragged him directly down to the massive, crowded main lobby. They paraded him violently in his ruined tailored suit, crying and screaming completely hysterically directly in front of every single one of his wealthy corporate employees and the massive crowd of federal auditors swarming his building. His complete and total public destruction was absolutely final. I stood completely quietly in the center of the massive, empty boardroom. The rain was still beating heavily against the towering glass windows, but the dark, violent storm inside my own chest had completely passed. Sarah slowly turned around and looked at me. She did not say a single word. She just walked across the thick carpet and buried her bruised face deeply into my heavy chest. I wrapped my thick, calloused arms securely entirely around her battered shoulders, holding her incredibly tight. I rested my rough chin gently on the top of her messy hair and closed my tired old eyes. We had completely won. The massive, corrupt machine was entirely dismantled and my family was completely safe. It has been exactly 3 months since I walked into that downtown Atlanta boardroom and tore a corrupt corporate empire completely to the ground. The heavy, dark dust has finally settled over our lives. The massive legal machine that Trent tried to use to completely destroy me ended up being the exact same machine that crushed him into absolute dust. He is currently sitting inside a highly secure federal detention center waiting for his official sentencing. The senior federal prosecutors offered him absolutely no deals. He is facing a mandatory minimum of 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud, interstate kidnapping, and the attempted murder of his own wife. He will be an old broken man if he ever sees the outside of a concrete wall again. His expensive custom-tailored silk suits have been completely replaced by a cheap, stiff, bright orange jumpsuit. The massive high-rise office building where he once ruled like a greedy, arrogant king has been completely liquidated by the federal government. The federal auditors from the Securities and Exchange Commission spent 3 full weeks completely tearing through Trent's massive corporate ledgers. They found every single hidden offshore account. They traced every single stolen dollar back to the shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and they successfully froze the massive illegal wire transfers. Hundreds of innocent, hardworking clients received their stolen life savings back simply because we made that one single anonymous phone call from a cheap plastic burner phone. Trent's massive wealthy business partners desperately tried to distance themselves from his terrible crimes, but the federal government heavily fined the entire firm and completely shut down their trading floor. The shiny mahogany tables and the thick protective glass whiteboards from that massive boardroom were all completely auctioned off by the federal courts to pay the massive victim restitution. Vance Buster Hayes did not fare much better. When the heavily armed federal agents showed up at his dirty salvage yard, he immediately dropped to his heavy knees in the muddy dirt and surrendered. He took a coward's plea deal the very next morning. He completely rolled over on Trent, giving the federal prosecutors every single piece of dirty physical evidence they needed in exchange for a slightly reduced sentence. He will still spend the next 15 years completely locked inside a dirty state prison where a man with his specific violent reputation will not have a very comfortable life behind bars. The corrupt county judge who tried to sign my daughter's life away quietly resigned from his powerful position in absolute public disgrace. The federal authorities are currently heavily investigating his private bank accounts and his expensive country club memberships. He will likely be wearing matching heavy federal handcuffs very soon. As for my beautiful daughter Sarah, she has completely transformed. The terrible dark purple bruises on her face have completely healed, leaving absolutely no physical scars behind. But the deep emotional scars have forged her into an incredibly strong, fiercely independent woman. She immediately filed for a permanent divorce, and the federal family courts granted her absolute full permanent legal custody of her 2 young children. Her massive inherited family trust fund is entirely secured and completely protected from any outside legal interference. She took that money and did something incredibly beautiful with it. She completely remodeled my old worn-down farmhouse. We knocked down the heavy interior walls and built 2 bright, beautiful new bedrooms for the children. The house that used to feel like a cold, empty, silent stone tomb is now completely filled with warm, bright sunlight and the loud, joyful laughter of my grandchildren. My 2 young grandchildren are doing incredibly well. The first few weeks were very hard. They had been absolutely terrified when the corrupt local police took them away from their school and placed them with strangers in a secure location. But children are incredibly resilient. They bounce back with a bright, pure energy that adults simply cannot comprehend. Every single morning I make them thick buttermilk pancakes and warm maple syrup. I walk them down the long dirt driveway to wait for the bright yellow school bus. I stand there by the mailbox like a heavy silent guard, making absolutely sure they get on the bus safely. They wave at me from the windows and I wave back. That simple, quiet morning routine is the absolute greatest treasure I could ever possibly ask for. Trent completely failed to break them. He completely failed to steal their bright future. I am standing out in my old garage right now. The heavy wooden doors are wide open, letting the warm, bright Georgia sunshine pour directly over the cracked concrete floor. I am wiping thick, dark engine grease off my calloused hands with an old red shop rag. I can hear my young grandson laughing wildly in the backyard, pushing his little sister on the heavy tire swing I built for them just last week. Listening to that pure, innocent sound makes my old chest ache with an incredibly deep, profound gratitude. I look down at my hands. The deep, permanent black stains are still worked heavily into the rough skin. My thick knuckles are still deeply swollen with severe arthritis. My lower back still aches terribly every single time a cold rainstorm rolls over the mountains. I am an old man. I know exactly what society sees when they look at a man like me. They look at our gray hair, our slow, heavy steps, and our dirty, worn-out canvas work coats. They make a terrible, arrogant assumption. They assume that because our bodies are slowly breaking down, our fighting days are completely over. They firmly believe we are deaf, slow, ignorant, and incredibly easily manipulated. They think we are simply fading quietly into the background, waiting patiently for the end of our time. but they fundamentally misunderstand the absolute core nature of a father. A father's love does not age. It does not grow weak or tired or fragile with the passing years. It actually does the exact opposite. A father's love gets incredibly hard. It becomes dense and heavy like solid cast iron left in a blazing hot forge for 40 years. The younger men in their expensive tailored suits and their shiny German luxury cars think they hold all the power in the world because they can move invisible numbers around on a glowing computer screen. They think their massive corporate wealth makes them entirely untouchable, but they have absolutely no idea what real power actually is. Real power is a father standing in the freezing dark rain holding a heavy solid steel pipe wrench completely ready to die for his child. Real power is a grandfather willing to tear down heaven and earth to protect his own blood. We do not fight for money. We do not fight for corporate power or greedy, arrogant pride. We fight because the people we love are our entire world. And when someone violently threatens our world, we will completely dismantle their entire life piece by piece until there is absolutely nothing left. We are the quiet men. We are the hard-working men who rebuild the heavy diesel engines, who pour the freezing concrete, and who drive the massive trucks across the dark country. We do not speak loudly, and we do not demand public attention. But when the dark wolves come knocking at our front doors looking to hurt our families, we do not cower in fear. We step directly out of the shadows, and we become the absolute most dangerous creatures in the entire forest. We will gladly sacrifice our freedom, our bodies, and our very lives to make absolutely sure our children can sleep safely in their beds. Trent learned that lesson the absolute hardest way possible. He thought I was just a senile old fool with a bad back. He completely forgot that a master mechanic knows exactly how to break a machine. Every single day I wake up before the sun rises. I walk out to this garage and I smell the familiar sharp scent of motor oil and old dust. It grounds me. It reminds me of the 40 long, hard years I spent working under heavy, dangerous commercial transport trucks. Every single hour of that back-breaking labor was a dedicated act of absolute pure love for my family. I traded the strong, healthy cartilage in my knees and the smooth skin on my hands to put warm food on our table and a solid roof over our heads. I never once complained because providing for my family was the greatest absolute honor of my entire life. When Sarah was a little girl, she used to sit right here on an old, overturned plastic bucket and watch me work. She would hand me the heavy steel wrenches and ask me a million questions about how the massive engines worked. I taught her that every single small part has a vital physical purpose. I taught her that if you completely ignore a tiny strange noise in the engine, it will eventually destroy the entire massive machine. I truly believe those long, quiet lessons in this dirty garage are exactly what gave her the incredible absolute strength to survive that terrible remote hunting cabin. She knew exactly how to endure the heavy pain. She knew exactly how to wait for the exact right moment to strike back. The world is incredibly fast now. Everything is digital and temporary. People throw things away the exact second they stop working perfectly. They do that with marriages. They do that with loyalties. And sadly, some evil people even do that with their own families. But men like me, we do not throw broken things away. We take them completely apart. We meticulously clean the dirty pieces. We replace the ruined parts and we carefully put the whole thing back together much stronger than it ever was before. That is exactly what my daughter and I are doing right now. We are slowly, carefully rebuilding our beautiful family. The heavy dark shadow of Trent has been completely, permanently erased from our lives. Sometimes I just sit in my old wooden chair by my heavy steel workbench and listen to the quiet, peaceful sounds of the countryside. I look at the massive, heavy-duty tools hanging on the wooden pegboard. The huge torque wrenches, the thick steel ratchets, the heavy air compressors. These physical tools built my entire life. They paid for Sarah's college education and they paid for the solid roof over our heads. Trent thought he could outsmart me because he read thick financial books and wore expensive silk ties. He completely forgot that a man who works with his hands understands the fundamental absolute truth of the physical world. For every single action, there is a heavy, violent reaction. You cannot simply smash a man's entire world and expect him to quietly sweep up the broken glass. I am absolutely not a violent man by nature. I have spent my entire long life trying to be a good, honest neighbor and a quiet, humble citizen. But there is a very dark, heavy line drawn deeply in the sand. When you maliciously cross that line and threaten the innocent blood of my family, I will completely transform. I will gladly become the absolute worst nightmare you have ever had. I will happily spend the rest of my natural life in a cold, dark prison cell if it means my daughter gets to walk free in the warm sunlight. That is the fundamental, undeniable promise of a father. It is a heavy blood oath we take the exact second we hold our children for the absolute first time. I look out the open garage door and see Sarah walking across the bright green grass. She is carrying a large glass pitcher of cold sweet tea. She is smiling. It is a real, genuine, beautiful smile that reaches all the way up to her bright eyes. The heavy, crushing burden of fear has been completely lifted from her small shoulders. She calls out my name, telling me to come sit on the porch and rest my tired, heavy legs. I wave my thick, dark hand at her and tell her I will be right there. I want to take a moment to speak directly to the people listening to my story right now. If you are a parent or a grandparent watching this, never let anyone underestimate your worth. You are the shield of your family. Society might look past you. The younger generation might think you are entirely out of touch with the modern world. But you possess a deep, heavy wisdom that only comes from surviving decades of hard struggles. You are the strong, solid foundation of your family. Do not ever let anyone convince you that your fighting days are completely over. Your absolute greatest strength is the quiet, fierce love you carry deep inside your chest. We will tear down heaven and earth to protect our blood. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments below. What time is it right now where you are, and what city are you watching from? I love seeing how far this community reaches. Keep your eyes open, protect your flock, and remember, the truth always comes to the light. This is Walter Hayes signing off. God bless. God.